The home of good food is Howard Johnson. Now have Howard Johnson's good food at home.
Nobody told you these places would disappear. Nobody explained why the booth you always sat in, the menu you knew by heart, the sign you could spot a mile down the highway, would all just stop existing one day. It didn't need explaining. You were a kid. The restaurant was simply there, the same way the school was there, the same way your street was there. You ate at these places without ever once thinking they were temporary. 20 of them, scattered across 20 different towns. All gone now, all real, all waiting somewhere in the back of your memory for someone to finally say their names out loud again. 1. Howard Johnson's. You knew the orange roof before you knew the name on it. It sat up high, sloped and bright, with a little blue cupola on top. You could see it from far down the highway, way before you could read any sign. Your dad would spot it first. He'd say one word, Hojo's, and that was enough. The whole car would relax a little, because you knew what came next. That roof was on purpose. Howard Deering Johnson built his restaurants that way so drivers could find them from a distance, long before fast food chains thought to do the same thing. White walls, blue trim, an orange tile roof, and a weather vane shaped like a boy and a peaman on top. Every Howard Johnson's looked almost exactly the same, in every state, on every highway. That was the rule. You never had to guess what you'd get inside, because the building told you before you even parked. Everyone who grew up traveling by car in those years understood that roof the same way they understood a stop sign. The ice cream counter was the first thing you noticed walking in. It ran along one wall, usually near the front, with round metal tubs lined up under the glass. The flavors had handwritten cards in front of them, and there were always 28. Not 25, not 30. 28, every single time, in every Howard Johnson's in the country. Howard Johnson made his ice cream with almost double the butterfat of regular ice cream, which is why it tasted heavier and richer than anything from a grocery store freezer. Banana, pistachio, peppermint stick, fruit salad. You picked one, and your parents picked one, and somebody always asked what fruit salad ice cream actually tasted like. Nobody ever fully agreed on the answer. That was simply part of going to Hojo's. The fried clams were the dish everybody talked about on the drive home. They came in a paper boat, golden and crisp, no bellies in them, just the firm part of the clam fried in a thick batter. The recipe came from two brothers in Massachusetts named Sofron, who figured out how to make clams without the bellies. And Howard Johnson liked the idea so much he built his supply chain around it. 7 separate clam processing plants worked just to keep enough clams moving into Howard Johnson's kitchens. You ordered them because your father ordered them, and your father ordered them because his father had ordered them before him. Nobody needed to explain why. The clams were simply what you got at a Howard Johnson's, the same way you got a hot dog at a ballpark. The hot dogs came on a bun that stood up straight on its own. Howard Johnson's worked with a bakery in Maine to design a bun sliced across the top instead of the side, so it would hold its shape and not fall apart once it was filled. That bun was built for the fried clams first, but it worked so well that Hojo's used it for their hot dogs too, which they called Frankfurts on the menu. That style of bun spread across New England and beyond it, and most people who ate one never thought to ask why it looked different from a regular hot dog bun. It looked that way because Howard Johnson wanted it that way. That was the standard, and the standard never changed from one location to the next. The children's menu kept you busy before the food even came. It wasn't just a smaller plate at a smaller price. Some of the menus folded into paper masks if you added a string. Some had maps of the whole country printed on the back, and one even taught kids the metric system, which was a strange thing to find next to a hot dog order. You colored on it, folded it, and asked your mom what half the words meant, all before your food showed up. That was part of the wait. Every family with a kid in the car knew the menu was there to do exactly that. It kept you occupied, and it kept the table calm, and everyone understood that without being told. Every Howard Johnson's tasted the same no matter where you stopped. The company ran its restaurants from a strict operating manual that covered nearly everything, down to how the uniforms were worn and how the food was prepared. A meal in Kansas was built to taste the same as a meal in Connecticut. The chefs who developed some of the recipes for Howard Johnson's, including the clam chowder, had worked in serious kitchens before joining the company, and one of them later wrote about cooking that chowder in batches of 3,000 gallons at a time. You never thought about any of that as a kid. You just knew the food tasted right, every single time, at every single stop. That was the whole point. Consistency was the promise, even if nobody at your table ever used that word for it. You stopped needing Howard Johnson's the same way you'd stop needing a lot of things from the road. Gas got expensive, faster chains opened next to the highway exits, and they didn't need a dining room or a waitress to serve you. Howard Johnson's restaurants closed one by one through the 1980s and into the 1990s, sold off piece by owners who weren't interested in keeping the orange roofs standing. By the 2000s, most of the roofs that hadn't been torn down had simply been repainted to match whatever business moved in after. One Howard Johnson's, in Lake George, New York, held on the longest of all of them, the very last one in the entire country, until it finally shut its doors for good. You remember the roof more than you remember the day it disappeared. You remember the ice cream more than you remember why there used to be 28 flavors. And somewhere, parked along a stretch of highway you haven't driven in years, there is still a building with a strange, narrow shape and a blue cupola on top, doing something else entirely now, with nobody left to explain what it used to be. There's another one of these that didn't disappear from highways. It disappeared from inside a movie theater, with the smell of popcorn baked right into the walls. 2. Burger Chef. You built your own burger before that was something anyone else let you do. Burger Chef called it the Works Bar, a long counter set up near the front of the restaurant with bowls of lettuce, tomato, onion, pickles, and ketchup laid out for anyone to use. You walked your own tray down the line and decided for yourself how loaded your burger would get. No other big chain was doing that yet. McDonald's handed you a burger already made. Burger Chef handed you the parts and let you finish the job. That was the whole point of going there instead of somewhere else, and every regular customer understood it without anyone explaining the difference. The flame broiler under the counter was the real reason the burgers tasted different. 2 brothers from Indianapolis named Frank and Donald Thomas built broiling machines for a living before they ever opened a restaurant. Their company made equipment that other diners and drive-ins used to cook food, and the brothers figured the best way to prove their machines worked was to run a restaurant of their own with one built right in. That machine could turn out around 2,000 burgers an hour, cooked over an open flame instead of fried on a flat grill. The Big Chef and the Super Chef both came off that same broiler, and that smoky, charred taste was what people kept coming back for. You didn't know the name of the machine in the back. You just knew the burger tasted like it had been cooked outside, not boiled in grease. The fun meal was sitting in front of kids years before anybody else thought to do it. In 1973, Burger Chef put together a box made just for children, with a burger, fries, a drink, a cookie, and a small toy packed inside. The box itself had stories printed on it about 2 cartoon characters named Burger Chef and Jeff, along with a cast of side characters that included a magician, a vampire named Count Fangburger, and a witch called Cackleburger. You read the riddles while you waited for your food. You peeled the toy out of its little wrapper before you even touched the burger. When McDonald's rolled out its own version of that idea 6 years later and called it the Happy Meal, Burger Chef actually sued them over it and lost. Most kids who grew up loving the Happy Meal never knew it had a Burger Chef-shaped fingerprint on it. Going there with your parents meant getting asked the same question every single time. You knew exactly what your mom was going to say before she said it. Big Chef or Super Chef? Burger Chef built its menu around that one decision, the same way McDonald's built its menu around the choice between a hamburger and a Quarter Pounder. The Big Chef was a double burger with cheese, made to compete directly with the Big Mac. The Super Chef was the bigger version. You picked one, your sister picked the other, and somebody always wanted to trade halfway through the meal. That back and forth was just part of eating there. Nobody had to explain the menu. You'd been answering that question your whole childhood. By the early 1970s, the orange and brown sign was almost as common as the golden arches. Burger Chef grew fast through the late 1950s and 1960s, and by 1971, it had climbed to roughly 1,200 locations spread across the country, second only to McDonald's in the entire fast food industry. That kind of growth meant a Burger Chef wasn't a rare find. It sat near the high school, near the bowling alley, near the strip mall, in towns big and small across the Midwest especially. For a long stretch of the 1970s, picking Burger Chef over McDonald's wasn't even an unusual choice. Plenty of families had a Burger Chef that was simply closer, simpler, and theirs. Then the company that owned it stopped acting like it understood the restaurant at all. The Thomas brothers sold Burger Chef to General Foods in 1968, a company that mostly made packaged groceries like breakfast cereal, not burgers. General Foods kept expanding the chain through the 1970s, but it struggled to manage the day-to-day running of restaurants the way a true restaurant company would. Locations started closing instead of opening. By the time the 1970s were ending, Burger Chef had already shut down nearly half the restaurants it once had. The brand that almost outpaced McDonald's was quietly shrinking, and most of the customers eating a Big Chef on a Friday night had no idea how much trouble the company was already in. One terrible night in Indiana changed how people thought about the name for good. In November of 1978, 4 young employees closing up the Burger Chef in Speedway, Indiana, were kidnapped after their shift. Their bodies were found 2 days later in a nearby county. The case made national news, shook the small community around that restaurant, and has never been solved. It's a hard thing to include in a story about ice cream counters and toy giveaways. But it happened, and it became part of the chain's history whether anyone wanted it to be or not. The tragedy added more weight to a brand that was already struggling, at a time when it could least afford anything else going wrong. By 1982, the company gave up trying to save it on its own. General Foods sold what was left of Burger Chef, just under 700 locations, to a company called Imasco, which also owned Hardee's. Many Burger Chef restaurants got the sign swapped out and reopened as Hardee's within a few years. Others closed outright. The cartoon mascots disappeared from packaging. The Works Bar disappeared from the dining room. One by one, the towns that had a Burger Chef stopped having one, and most people never got a clear explanation of why. It simply wasn't there the next time you drove past. The very last Burger Chef standing was in Cookeville, Tennessee, and it held on until 1996, long after almost everyone else had given up the name. A few buildings shaped like old Burger Chefs are still standing here and there, selling something else entirely now, the roofline the only thing left that gives away what used to be inside. You can still find people online trading old photos of the Works Bar, the orange trays, the fun meal boxes nobody saved. The burgers are gone, the mascots are gone, but for anyone who grew up building their own burger at that counter, the name still means something nobody else's restaurant ever quite replaced. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that vanished for reasons that had nothing to do with burgers or competition at all. It got dragged down by its own name, and by a children's book nobody wanted attached to a restaurant anymore. 3. Sambo's. You ordered off the same menu in every state, and the name on the door was the first thing that explained why you were there. Sambo's opened its first restaurant on June 17, 1957, on the beach in Santa Barbara, California. The 2 men who started it, Sam Battistone Sr. and Newell Bonnet, said the name came from putting their own names together, Sam and Bo. The restaurant served pancakes for 40 cents and a full breakfast for a little more than $1, with a slogan that promised a good 10-cent cup of coffee. You walked in for cheap, simple food, and that was exactly what you got. Bottomless coffee, a counter with 45 seats, and a family working the grill themselves in those early years. That part of the story was plain and ordinary, the same way 100 other diners from that decade started out. The walls inside told a different story than the menu did. From very early on, Sambo's decorated its dining rooms with murals based on a children's book called The Story of Little Black Sambo, first published in 1899. The murals showed a dark-skinned boy and a group of tigers, tied to a tale about tigers turning into butter that gets poured over pancakes. By the early 1960s, some locations changed the boy in the artwork to a lighter-skinned figure wearing a turban, but the tigers and the connection to that story stayed part of the brand. The company leaned into it on purpose, using the imagery to build a kids' club called the Tiger Tamers. You might have grown up thinking the cartoon tiger on the wall was just a friendly mascot. For many other families, walking past that same mural meant something very different, and it told them plainly that the restaurant wasn't built with them in mind. The pancakes kept people coming back no matter what was happening with the name. The breakfast menu had real variety for a diner chain, with options like the Papa Jumbo Special, which came with juice, eggs, bacon or sausage, and pancakes stacked high. There was a cottage cheese and peach salad on the menu too, along with dinner items ranging from fried chicken to filet mignon. Families ate there because the food was filling, the prices were fair, and the restaurant felt like it belonged to the neighborhood, the same as any other diner chain from that era. You knew the Papa Jumbo by name before you knew anything about where the restaurant's name had really come from. Growth came faster than almost anyone expected. Sambo's expanded through the 1960s and 1970s by offering managers a stake in the restaurants they ran, a setup the company called Fraction of the Action. That program brought in experienced operators who wanted ownership, not just a paycheck, and it helped the chain explode across the country. By 1979, Sambo's had grown to 1,117 restaurants, spread across 47 states, making it one of the largest restaurant chains in America at the time. That kind of size meant a Sambo's wasn't hard to find on a long drive, whether you were in California or somewhere much farther east. The same program that built the chain helped take it apart just a few years later. In 1977, action from the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission forced Sambo's to end the fraction of the action program. Without that ownership incentive, experienced managers left the company in large numbers, and many of their replacements had little experience running a restaurant. Profits dropped fast after that. By 1979, 600 managers had already walked out, and the company was dealing with lawsuits and financial trouble on top of the management exodus. None of that had anything to do with the murals on the wall, but it was happening at the exact same time the protests against the name were getting louder. By the late 1970s, two separate pressures were closing in on the company at once. Civil rights groups, including the NACP, organized protests and lawsuits against the Sambo's name and its imagery for years. The company tried renaming some locations to No Place Like Sam's and later to Jolly Tiger, hoping a fresh name might quiet the criticism and steady the business. Neither rename worked. In November 1981, with the protests still going and the finances already collapsing, Sambo's filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company shut down 447 restaurants in that filing alone and laid off 10,000 employees. By 1984, nearly every remaining Sambo's had either closed for good or been sold off and renamed under a different chain entirely. One single restaurant refused to disappear with the rest of them. The original Sambo's, right where it had opened back in 1957 on Cabrillo Boulevard in Santa Barbara, kept running under the Sambo's name for decades after every other location was gone. It passed down to Sam Battistone's grandson, Chad Stevens, who kept the old murals on the wall and the original menu items on the board. That lasted until the summer of 2020, when protests following the murder of George Floyd reached Santa Barbara, and a petition asked the family to finally retire the name. In July of 2020, after 63 years, the sign came down, and the restaurant reopened as Chad's. You can still get pancakes at that same address on that same beach today. You just won't find the name or the murals that the whole chain was built around. There's another one coming up next that also built its whole identity around a self-serve bar nobody else had figured out how to do yet, years before salad bars were anywhere close to ordinary. It didn't fall apart over its name. It fell apart trying to keep up with everybody who copied the idea first. 4. Red Barn. You could spot the building before you could read the sign, the same way you could spot a real barn out in a field. Red Barn opened in 1961 in Springfield, Ohio, started by three men named Don Six, Martin Levine, and Jim Kirst. Every location was built to look like an actual barn, bright red with white trim, big glass windows across the front, and a sloped roof that made it look more like something out of a farm than a fast food stop. By the mid-1960s, that barn shape was popping up across whole new states, and by the time the chain hit its peak, there were 300 to 400 of them spread across 19 states, plus locations in Canada and even Australia. You didn't need the name lit up to know you'd found one. The shape alone told you. The salad bar was the thing nobody else had thought to try yet. Red Barn became the first fast food chain in the country to offer a self-serve salad bar, letting you walk up and build your own plate instead of ordering whatever came already made. That idea felt strange and new in the 1960s, since most fast food places only sold sandwiches and fries, with no fresh vegetables in sight. A 1977 commercial for the chain even had actress Lonnie Anderson joking that the salad bar was a Garden of Eden. You filled your own plate, sat back down, and went back for seconds if you wanted, which wasn't something any other burger chain let you do at the time. The Big Barney came to your table years before anybody had ever heard of a Big Mac. Red Barn built its menu around two signature burgers, the Big Barney and the Barnbuster. The Big Barney was a double-decker burger that came out years ahead of McDonald's Big Mac, and the Barnbuster matched up against things like the Quarter Pounder and the Whopper once those showed up later. Alongside the burgers, Red Barn sold fried chicken and fish, with chicken dinners sometimes priced as low as 59 or 99 cents. You picked a burger, or you picked the chicken, and either way you walked out with more food on your tray than most other fast food stops gave you for the same price. The cartoon characters on the menu boards were as familiar as the food itself. Red Barn built its advertising around three mascots called the Hungries, named Big Fish Hungry, Hamburger Hungry, and Chicken Hungry. They showed up in television commercials with a catchy jingle that went, "When the Hungries hit the Red Barn." Kids knew those characters from the ads on Saturday morning television long before they ever sat down in a booth. The mascots matched the food on the menu almost exactly. One for burgers, one for chicken, one for fish. So picking a meal and picking a cartoon friend ended up being almost the same decision. The company that owned Red Barn kept changing hands, and each new owner cared less than the last one. Red Barn was bought by Richard Kearns in 1963, then later picked up by a company called United Servomation in the late 1960s. In 1978, that company merged with a division of City Investing Company that also owned the Motel 6 motel chain. The new owners were mainly interested in real estate, construction, and financial deals, not in running restaurants. They stopped advertising the Red Barn name and let the franchise leases run out, instead of renewing them. By 1983, the chain that once had hundreds of locations was down to about 100. A New York businessman bought what remained that same year, but it was already too late to turn things around. By the time the bankruptcy papers were filed, almost nothing was left to save. Red Barn declared bankruptcy in 1986, with only about 22 restaurants still standing. A few locations kept going for a while longer, under a new name, The Farm, using the exact same barn-shaped building and even some of the same menu items, just without the Red Barn name attached. The very last of those rebranded locations finally closed in 2020, decades after the original company had given up on the brand. Today, the barn-shaped buildings are mostly gone or turned into something else entirely, but the people who grew up filling their own salad plate at one of them still trade memories about it online, in groups built just to keep the name from disappearing completely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that didn't sell salads or fried chicken at all. It sold beer-steamed hot dogs, and it was run for a while by the same man who later became governor of Kentucky. 5. Lums. You smelled the beer before you saw the menu. Lums got its start in 1956, when brothers Stuart and Clifford Pearlman bought a 16-seat hot dog stand on a busy street in Miami Beach for around $10,000. The stand already had a name, Lums, and the brothers kept it. Their twist was simple. Instead of boiling or grilling the hot dogs, they steamed them in beer, mixed with water, caraway seeds, onions, and spices. That steam carried the smell of beer right out into the dining room, so before your food ever hit the table, you already knew what kind of place you were in. By 1961, the brothers had grown that one stand into 4 restaurants across South Florida, all built on the same beer-steamed hot dog. The hot dog wasn't just a gimmick, it was the whole identity of the place. Lums sold its beer-steamed hot dog at a price low enough that the chain became a regular stop for teenagers, families, and college students alike. You could even order it with sherry-flavored sauerkraut on top for a few cents more. Some locations offered an international beer list to wash it down with, including beers from places like Japan, Denmark, Germany, and the Philippines, which was an unusual thing for a casual chain restaurant to offer in the early 1970s. The hot dog gave Lums something none of the burger chains around it had. You didn't go to Lums because it was the closest place. You went because nowhere else made a hot dog quite the same way. By the late 1960s, the Pearlman brothers were running 2 very different businesses at once. Lums went public on the New York Stock Exchange in 1969. The same year, the Pearlmans made a move nobody expected from 2 men who built their fortune on hot dogs. They bought Caesar's Palace, the 500-room hotel and casino on the Las Vegas Strip, for $60 million, while Lums kept opening new locations and reached around 400 restaurants by 1972, stretching into Puerto Rico and parts of Europe. Clifford Pearlman was now spending more of his attention running a casino than running a hot dog chain. The 2 businesses didn't have much in common, and something eventually had to give. In 1971, the Pearlmans chose the casino, and Lums got a brand new owner. The brothers sold the food side of the company to John Y. Brown Jr., who had built his own fortune as chairman of Kentucky Fried Chicken. Brown wanted to change up the Lums menu, and he found his answer in a tiny 20-seat burger spot in Miami Beach called Ollie's Sandwich Shop. He paid the owner, Ollie Gleichenhaus, $1 million for his burger recipe, a thick patty seasoned with a long list of spices. Brown put it on the Lums menu as the Ollie Burger, and for the rest of the 1970s, that burger sat right alongside the beer-steamed hot dog as the 2 things people ordered without even glancing at the rest of the menu. Milton Berle telling you to go to Lum's was as familiar as the smell of the hot dogs themselves. Starting in 1975, the comedian Milton Berle became the television spokesman for Lum's, appearing in commercials that ran for years afterward. His face on a Lum's ad meant the same thing to people watching television in the 1970s that a jingle meant for other chains. You didn't need him to explain what was on the menu. Between Berle on television and the Ollie Burger and the hot dogs on the table, Lum's had built a personality that stood apart from the burger chains crowding the same strip malls. The chain Brown took over, kept shrinking no matter what got added to the menu. By 1978, the number of Lum's locations had fallen from a peak of about 450 down to 273. That year, Brown sold what remained to a Swiss company called Wienerwald, which mainly specialized in chicken and schnitzel, nothing close to beer-steamed hot dogs. The mismatch confused American customers from the start, and the new ownership never managed to turn the slide around. In 1982, Lum's filed for bankruptcy, and most of its remaining restaurants closed in the years that followed. One single Lum's managed to outlast every other location in the entire country, sitting in Bellevue, Nebraska, long after the rest of the chain had disappeared. That last restaurant finally closed its doors in 2017, more than 60 years after two brothers in Miami Beach first decided that hot dogs steamed in beer might be worth selling. There's another one coming up that also leaned on a name nobody expected to find on a fast food sign, a British actor who never cooked a single piece of fish in his life, but ended up as the face of fish and chips across America. 6. Arthur Treacher's Fish and Chips. You ordered fish and chips from a man who had never fried a single piece of fish in his life. Arthur Treacher's Fish and Chips opened its first restaurant in 1969 in Columbus, Ohio. Started by a company called National Fast Food Corp. 3 men built it. Robert Davis, a real estate developer who had built and leased Kentucky Fried Chicken properties. L.S. Hartzog, who ran a chain of bakeries supplying biscuits to KFC franchises. And Davis's friend Dave Thomas, who would go on to found Wendy's a few years later. They wanted real, authentic fish and chips, the kind you'd get in England, not a fast food imitation of it. So they went straight to the source. The company bought the exclusive rights to the recipe used by Mallins, a fish and chip shop in Bow, London, that's recorded as the very first one in England, dating all the way back to the 1860s. That recipe, brought across the ocean, became the foundation of everything the chain served from that point forward. The face on the door wasn't a cartoon. It was a real actor who'd spent his whole career playing someone else's butler. The founders needed a name that sounded properly British, and they landed on Arthur Treacher, an English character actor born in 1894 who had built a long career playing stuffy, perfectly mannered butlers. He'd played Jeeves in several Shirley Temple films, Constable Jones in Mary Poppins, and by the time the restaurant chain started, he was best known as the sidekick and announcer on The Merv Griffin Show. The company bought the rights to use his name and his face, and Treacher served as the chain's spokesman through its early years. Even though it was never proven that he had any financial stake in the business itself, he showed up at restaurant openings riding in a London-style double-decker bus, which was about as British an entrance as a man could make in a strip mall parking lot in Ohio. The lantern sign told you exactly what you were walking into before you read a single word of the menu. Every Arthur Treacher's carried a yellow lantern-shaped sign out front, a detail that became as recognizable to regular customers as any logo from that decade. Inside, the menu kept things simple and direct. Fried cod fillets, French fries that the chain called chips on the menu to keep with the British theme, hush puppies, and clam strips made up the core of what you ordered, sometimes alongside fried chicken for anyone who wanted something other than seafood. You didn't go there expecting a long list of choices. You went there for one specific thing, made the same way every single time, and that consistency became the whole reason people kept coming back. The chain grew faster than almost anyone selling fish and chips in America had grown before. Through the early and mid-1970s, Arthur Treacher's expanded at a rapid pace, advertising heavily and riding a broader wave of interest in British culture that was moving through America at the time. Other fish-focused chains, including Long John Silver's, Captain D's, and Skipper's, started up around the same period, but Arthur Treacher's advertising is credited with helping introduce authentic-style fish and chips to a much wider American audience than had ever tried it before. By the late 1970s, the chain reached its peak with 826 locations spread across the country. For a few years there, ordering fried cod and chips from a restaurant named after a British butler actor wasn't an unusual thing to do. It was just what you did on a Friday night. Then a fight between two countries on the other side of the ocean changed what was sitting in the fryer. Between 1975 and 1976, the United Kingdom and Iceland clashed over fishing rights in what became known as the Cod Wars. The dispute eventually shut down Icelandic fishing grounds and effectively ended Britain's long-distance cod fishing entirely. Cod prices in America climbed fast, in some cases nearly doubling, and that single ingredient sat at the center of almost everything Arthur Treacher's sold. Franchise owners felt the cost increase immediately, and profits across the chain started sliding right as the company had been counting on continued growth. In 1979, with the company struggling, ownership of Arthur Treacher's passed to Mrs. Paul's Kitchen, a business that made its name selling frozen fish products in grocery stores. Mrs. Paul's executives made one decision that customers noticed almost right away. They replaced the cod in every fillet with pollock, a cheaper, oilier fish that cost less to buy but didn't taste the same on the plate. Franchise owners pushed back hard enough that the disagreement turned into a lawsuit, with operators arguing the switch had damaged the very thing that made the chain worth eating at in the first place. Mrs. Paul's lost that fight, but by then there was no way left to make the franchisees whole again. In March of 1982, Mrs. Paul's sold what remained of Arthur Treacher's to a Youngstown, Ohio investment group called Lumara Foods of America. The new owners didn't have much more time than the old ones. Just 4 months after taking over, Lumara Foods filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company changed hands again and again through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s, moving its headquarters more than once and slowly shrinking with every sale. A man named Jim Cataland folded the business into a shell company in 1985 and spent the better part of 8 years trying to rebuild it piece by piece. By 1993, a new round of investors moved the company's base all the way to Jacksonville, Florida, hoping a more modern seafood concept might finally turn things around. None of it stopped the slide. Through the 1990s and 2000s, location after location closed, until the once massive chain had shrunk down to a tiny fraction of what it used to be. By the early 2020s, only a handful of true Arthur Treacher's restaurants were left standing in the entire country, with the last few clustered in northeastern Ohio, not far from where the very first one had opened back in 1969. For a stretch in 2021, there was reportedly only a single location left anywhere in the country still frying fish the original way. That's when an unexpected name stepped in to keep it from disappearing for good. In 2006, Nathan's Famous, the hot dog company best known for its Coney Island stand and its annual hot dog eating contest, had already bought the rights to the Arthur Treacher's trademark. In 2021, Nathan's announced it would relaunch the brand through a ghost kitchen model, selling Arthur Treacher's fish and chips for delivery out of existing Nathan's locations, rather than building standalone restaurants from scratch. The new version kept the same hand-battered breading and the same hush puppies that longtime customers remembered, while bringing cod back onto the menu wherever it could be sourced, alongside Nathan's own hot dogs and newer chicken sandwiches on the same order screen. A handful of locations on Long Island now operate as combined Nathan's Famous and Arthur Treacher's counters, selling both brands side by side under one roof. You can still find a small number of the old standalone Arthur Treacher's restaurants in Ohio today, the lantern sign still hanging out front, still serving fish made close to the same way it was back when a British actor in a double-decker bus pulled up to cut the ribbon. The cod is no longer guaranteed, and the company has changed hands more times than most customers could ever keep track of. But the name held on, 50 years and several bankruptcies later, longer than almost anyone watching the Cod Wars unfold from a strip mall parking lot in Ohio would have guessed it could. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that didn't lose to a fish shortage or a corporate sale at all. For a few years in the late 1950s, it was actually opening restaurants faster than McDonald's, before an ice cream company decided it had better things to spend its money on. 7. Henry's Hamburgers. You ordered 10 burgers for $1, and it didn't feel like a gimmick. It felt like a fair deal. Henry's Hamburgers got its start in 1954, built not by a group of restaurant men but by an ice cream company. Bressler's Ice Cream Company, which had been making ice cream in Chicago since 1927, wanted a way to sell more of its malts and shakes without changing the ice cream parlors it already had running. The answer was a separate chain of burger drive-ins that could push Bressler's milkshakes alongside cheap food named Henry's in honor of Henry Bressler, one of the brothers who had founded the ice cream company and had since passed away. The whole concept borrowed heavily from a Southern California chain called Hamburger Handout, which itself had copied the format the McDonald brothers built out in San Bernardino. Henry's wasn't the first to copy that formula. It just happened to copy it well. The growth came fast enough to surprise the people who were supposed to be the competition. By 1956, just 2 years after the first Henry's opened, the chain already had 35 locations across the Chicago area alone. That kind of speed kept going through the rest of the decade, and by the early 1960s, Henry's Hamburgers had grown to more than 200 locations spread across the country, in 29 states and parts of Canada. At that exact moment, Henry's actually had more restaurants open than McDonald's did. You could walk into a Henry's in Chicago, then walk into another one in California or Florida, and the menu board and the price list would look almost exactly the same in either place. The price tag was the whole pitch, plain and simple. Henry's sold its hamburgers for 15 cents, the same price McDonald's was charging at the time. But Henry's pushed the deal one step further, with an offer advertised everywhere: 10 burgers for $1. French fries ran 10 cents, and the chain also sold a fish sandwich topped with tartar sauce for 29 cents, which functioned almost the same way McDonald's Filet-O-Fish would a few years later. You didn't drive to Henry's for anything fancy. You drove there because a family of 4 could eat a full meal and still have change left over. And that math worked the same way in nearly every town the chain reached. The slogans matched the simple, no-frills feel of the food itself. Henry's ran with lines like, "Aren't you hungry for a Henry's?" and "Head for Henry's." Nothing flashy, nothing built around a mascot or a jingle that stuck in your head for years. The restaurants themselves followed the drive-in model that was common across the Midwest at the time, with small staffs working electric grills inside a no-frills building, some locations even using car hop service, in the earliest years before that style started fading out everywhere. The experience was built around speed and a fair price, not around spectacle, and for a long stretch of the late 1950s and early 1960s, that was more than enough to keep the lines moving. By the late 1960s, the world around drive-in restaurants had started changing in ways Henry's was slow to notice. Other burger chains, especially McDonald's, began building dedicated drive-through lanes, letting customers order and pick up food without ever leaving their car. Henry's stuck mostly with its older carryout and car hop model for years afterward, and that hesitation started costing the chain customers who simply wanted the fastest possible option. National advertising budgets from McDonald's and Burger King kept growing larger every year, and Henry's, still tied to its roots as a side project for an ice cream company, didn't have anywhere close to the same money to spend competing for attention. Ownership changes inside the Bresler Company added another layer of trouble on top of the slowing growth. As the parent company went through mergers and shifts in leadership through the 1970s, the hamburger side of the business didn't get the same focus it once had. Locations across the country began closing, one after another, through the middle of that decade. One persistent rumor followed the chain's decline in Chicago specifically, even though nobody ever proved it true. Stories circulated that some Chicago area Henry's locations had started mixing horse meat, which was FDA approved at the time as a cheaper filler, into their hamburger patties without telling customers. No solid evidence of that practice has ever surfaced, but the rumor stuck to the chain's reputation in that city regardless, and it's often pointed to as one more reason the remaining Chicago locations shut their doors for good not long after. By the time the 1970s were over, almost every Henry's Hamburgers in the country had closed. Nearly the entire chain disappeared within that decade, except for one location. In April of 1959, 2 men named Don Bishop and Harold Shook had opened a Henry's in a new shopping center in Benton Harbor, Michigan. While other franchise owners followed every directive handed down by Bresler's corporate office, Bishop and Shook ran their restaurant by listening to their own customers instead, building a loyal local following that had nothing to do with what was happening at the national level. That difference in approach is the exact reason their restaurant survived everything that wiped out the rest of the chain around it. The Benton Harbor location stayed a carry-out-only operation for nearly 30 years, finally adding a drive-through window in 1988, decades after most fast food competitors had already made that change. That drive-through now accounts for more than 70% of the restaurant's business, a detail that says plenty about how much the rest of the industry had moved on, while this one location quietly held its ground. In 1987, long before value meals became standard across fast food, This last Henry's introduced something called the Brown Bag Special, a double cheeseburger, fries, and a Pepsi for one set price. An offer that still accounts for more than half of everything the restaurant sells in a given day. That single restaurant on M139 in Benton Harbor is still open today, still serving 15-cent era recipes updated for modern prices. The last living piece of a chain that once had more locations than McDonald's. People still write to the restaurant about it, including parents who named their children after the place. The rest of the chain disappeared so completely that most people today have never heard the name Henry's Hamburgers at all, even though for a few years in the late 1950s, it was genuinely winning the race McDonald's eventually ran away with. There's another one coming up next that lost that same race for a very different reason. It had 2 clown mascots and a budget-friendly burger that owned an entire borough of New York City, right up until McDonald's finally crossed a bridge it had been avoiding for years. 8. Wetsons. You knew the orange circles before you knew the name on the building, the same way drivers a state over knew a different roof shape entirely. Wetsons started in 1959, when a young man named Herbert Wettanson took a trip out to San Bernardino, California, and stumbled onto the original McDonald's hamburger stand, run by the McDonald brothers themselves. McDonald's hadn't reached New York yet, not even close, and Herbert came home from that trip convinced the same idea could work on Long Island. He and his younger brother Errol found a shuttered coffee and donut shop in Levittown, a town built right after the war for exactly the kind of working families McDonald's was already serving out west. They opened the first Wetsons there in 1959, with Herbert at 21 years old and Errol at 18. The menu looked a lot like the one that had inspired it, and nobody pretended otherwise. Wetsons sold 15-cent hamburgers, 10-cent fries cut fresh from real potatoes, and milkshakes, almost item for item the same lineup McDonald's was using out west. The chain's slogans leaned the same direction. Look for the orange circles, echoed McDonald's. Look for the golden arches, almost word for word. And buy a bagful borrowed, the same rhythm as White Castle's older slogan about buying them by the sack. None of that was hidden or disguised. Wetsons wasn't trying to invent something new. It was trying to bring something proven to a part of the country that didn't have it yet, and for a while, that was more than enough. 2 clowns greeted you at the counter, and you knew both of their names by heart. Wetsons built its own mascot pair, Wetty and Sunny, both dressed as clowns in the same spirit as Ronald McDonald, who McDonald's itself was still building into a national figure at the time. Wetty was female, Other was male, and the 2 of them showed up at restaurant openings, in print ads, and even at local elementary schools, where kids who grew up near a Wetsons remembered Sunny visiting in person. The clowns matched the bright orange rings that ringed the rooftop of every Wetsons building, a design detail so specific that people who grew up nearby could spot a former Wetsons location decades later just by the shape of the roofline, even with a different sign hanging underneath it. The Big W was the sandwich you ordered when you wanted something bigger than the basic 15-cent burger. Wetsons built its own answer to a stacked, double-decker hamburger years before McDonald's introduced the Big Mac nationally, and that bigger sandwich became the item regulars asked for by name. Alongside burgers and fries, the chain later added breakfast sandwiches and a fish fillet sandwich that some longtime customers remembered just as fondly as the burgers themselves, ordering it on repeat while waiting at a bus stop near one of the Queens locations. The food wasn't fancy. It didn't need to be. It just needed to be fast, cheap, and the same every time you came back. Growth came quickly once the first few locations proved the idea worked in New York, the same way it had out west. By 1964, Wetsons had grown to 14 locations. By the time the chain hit its peak, it had grown to somewhere between 70 and 72 restaurants, spread across New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. The company went public in 1969, offering shares of stock to the public for the first time, a clear sign that what had started as 2 brothers copying an idea from California had turned into a real regional business with real ambitions. One single grand opening for a new Wetsons location in West Brighton on Staten Island in August of 1970 reportedly gave away an estimated 10,000 free burgers in a single event, the kind of number that says plenty about how much excitement a new Wetsons could still generate in the New York area at that point. Then the chain Wetsons had been racing to beat finally showed up in its own backyard. McDonald's expansion into the New York metropolitan area accelerated through the early 1970s, bringing with it national advertising budgets and brand recognition that a regional chain built on imitation simply couldn't match once the original arrived in force. Burger King pushed into the same market around the same time, squeezing Wetsons from two directions at once. The cost of running the business kept climbing too. Ground meat that had cost Wetsons 30 cents a pound back in 1959 had climbed to 70 cents a pound by the early 1970s, eating into margins that were already thin from competing on price against companies with far deeper pockets. By the mid-1970s, the chain that had once given away 10,000 burgers in a single afternoon was running out of room to maneuver. Wetsons declared bankruptcy in the mid-1970s, and in 1975, the remaining 28 or 29 locations were merged into Nathan's Famous, the hot dog company that had been a New York institution since well before Wetsons ever opened its first orange-ringed building. Nathan's founder, Nathan Handwerker, had died in 1974, and his heirs struck the deal to absorb what was left of Wetsons, converting many of the old buildings into smaller Nathan's locations while keeping the same physical structure underneath. Customers who remembered the changeover described walking into a building they recognized completely, the white tile and orange rings still in place, with a new sign out front and hot dogs, fried clams, and breakfast sandwiches added to what used to be a Wetsons menu board. It even reportedly took some of those converted locations a while to switch over to selling Nathan's fries instead of the ones Wetsons had always served. The orange circles came down for good after that, one rooftop at a time, as the buildings either became Nathan's locations, got sold off to other businesses entirely, or were eventually torn down. People who grew up on Long Island still trade stories online about exactly which Wetsons used to sit on which corner, the way a record store moved into one building on the border of Hicksville and Westbury and kept the white tile and orange rings on the outside for years before a new owner finally stripped them away. Herbert Wittannson didn't disappear from the restaurant business after Wetsons closed. In 1978, he opened Dallas Barbecue in New York's East Village, a barbecue restaurant chain that grew to multiple locations across the city and is still family-owned today, run by 3 generations of the same family that once put orange rings on a rooftop in Levittown and dared McDonald's to catch up. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that didn't sell burgers at all, but it sold a sundae so enormous that finishing the whole thing by yourself earned you a button, a drum roll, and a permanent place in that restaurant's local legend. 9. Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor. You didn't go to Farrell's for a quick scoop, you went there for an event. Farrell's Ice Cream Parlor opened its very first location on September 13, 1963, on the corner of 21st and West Burnside in Portland, Oregon. 2 men started it, Bob Farrell and Ken McCarthy. And the first day was so busy it nearly broke them before they'd even gotten started. They ran out of ice cream and bananas before the day was over. They bought every hamburger the store above them could grind, every hamburger bun, every head of lettuce and tomato they could find from nearby stores just to keep up. Ken McCarthy remembered opening day with 32 employees, $1,300 in the bank, and $26,000 already owed. That kind of chaos on the very first day turned out to be a sign of exactly how popular the idea was about to become. Walking through the door felt like stepping into a different decade entirely. Farrell's built its restaurants around an early 1900s theme, with employees dressed in pinstriped vests and straw boater hats, the kind of costume you'd expect from an old-fashioned soda fountain rather than a modern restaurant. A player piano sat in the corner of every dining room, the kind that ran on a coin and played itself. Red flocked wallpaper covered the walls, and Tiffany-style lamps and small cherub fixtures hung overhead. Bob Farrell built the whole concept from 2 places at once. The old-fashioned ice cream parlors of New York City he remembered from his own childhood in Brooklyn, and the delicatessens and corner candy stores he grew up around there. The idea was simple on paper: build a place that felt wholesome and fun enough for families, kids, couples, and school groups to come celebrate something, with a menu built around burgers, sandwiches, and inventive ice cream treats. The desserts at Farrell's weren't really desserts, they were productions. The most famous item on the menu was the Zoo, a massive sundae built to feed a whole group, wheeled out to the table on a stretcher, while a siren wailed to announce its arrival. If you tried to take on one of the smaller, but still enormous sundaes by yourself, like the pig's trough, and actually finished it, the staff would come out banging a drum and announce your accomplishment to the entire restaurant. You'd walk away with a pin that read, "I made a pig of myself at Farrell's," a small piece of plastic that meant a lot more to a kid than its size suggested. The menu even included a joke page labeled a low-calorie diet menu, listing fake meals like bee's knees and mosquito knuckles. with a line underneath insisting anything worth eating has calories. Birthdays were where Farrell's really shined. Order a sundae on your birthday and it came free, which is part of why the restaurant became the default destination for an entire generation of kids' birthday parties. The chain spread fast once shopping malls started popping up across the country. By 1970, Bob Farrell had already grown the business to more than 50 locations spread across the West Coast. That same year, a new kind of retail space was booming nationwide, the enclosed shopping mall, and Farrell saw it as the perfect spot for his restaurants. Mall developers handled exterior maintenance, charged a manageable rent in exchange for guaranteed foot traffic, and the mall itself supplied a steady stream of families already out shopping together. It was a deal that worked well for both sides. In 1971, the Marriott Corporation bought the chain outright, and under their ownership, the number of Farrell's locations kept climbing, reaching as many as 120 to 130 parlors nationwide by 1975, spread not just across the West Coast anymore, but across the entire country. Two separate unrelated tragedies struck Farrell's locations years apart, and neither one had anything to do with how the restaurant was run. On September 24, 1972, a small jet leaving an air show in Sacramento failed to take off properly, ran off the end of the runway, and crashed directly into a Farrell's location in that city. 22 people inside the restaurant were killed and 28 more were injured. A decade later, in 1982, a separate small plane crashed in front of a different Farrell's location, this one in Torrance, California, killing those aboard the plane while sparing the people inside the restaurant itself. Neither disaster was connected to the business in any way, but both became part of the chain's history simply because of where they happened to land. You knew Bob Farrell himself was no longer the one running things when the parlors started feeling different. Farrell sold his stake in the chain to Marriott back in 1971 and 1972, but he stayed on as the company's public spokesman for years afterward, helping guide the brand even after it no longer belonged to him. He eventually stepped away from the company entirely, and once he left, the parlors that took on new ownership began drifting away from what had made them feel like Farrell's in the first place. New owners started toning down the make a pig of yourself theme that had defined the place for so long, gradually pushing the parlors closer to a more conventional family restaurant format, the kind built around standard menus instead of stretchers and sirens. By the time the 1980s were ending, that shift in identity, combined with rising prices and changing tastes, had pushed the chain into a steep decline. Marriott itself sold the company to a group of private investors in the mid-1980s. By 1990, the chain that once had well over 100 locations had nearly disappeared entirely. A handful of original parlors managed to hang on into the 2000s, including one in Portland that finally closed in 2006, and another in Eugene, Oregon, operating under a different name by the time it shut its doors in 2007. In 2008, after years of legal disputes over who actually owned the rights to the Farrell's name and trademarks, a company called Parlor Enterprises won the rights and opened 7 new Farrell's locations across California, bringing back the original concept, with founder Bob Farrell himself serving as an advisor to the relaunch. That revival didn't last either. By 2016, the relaunched company had built up $2 million in debt and started closing locations one at a time. Later that same year, the reality television show The Profit featured Farrell's, and businessman Marcus Lemonis stepped in as an investor, eventually becoming the majority owner of the brand. Even with his involvement and additional investment, locations kept closing through 2017 and 2018. The very last Farrell's ice cream parlor anywhere in the country, in Brea, California, finally shut its doors in 2019, more than 55 years after 2 men in Portland ran out of bananas on their very first day in business. There's another one coming up next that traded the player piano and the siren for cheap steakhouse fillets, built by a restaurateur who went on to shape almost every casual dining chain you've ever sat down in since. 10. Steak and Ale. You greeted your waiter by name, and your waiter greeted you the same way, because Steak and Ale taught an entire industry to do that. Norman Brinker opened the first Steak and Ale on Lemon Avenue in Dallas, Texas, on February 26, 1966. Brinker had already proven he understood restaurants by then. He'd worked his way up at Jack in the Box out in Southern California, helped grow it into a regional chain, then sold his stake when the company went public. After moving to Dallas, he opened a coffee shop called Brink's, and sold that too, and then turned his attention to a bigger idea. At the time, a steak dinner felt like something you only got at an expensive restaurant on a special occasion. Brinker wanted to take that same feeling and put it within reach of regular families on a regular night. You served yourself the salad before your meal even arrived, and nobody had really done that before. Steak and Ale built its dining room around an unlimited salad bar, letting customers get up from their table and build their own plate while waiting for the kitchen to finish their steak. Brinker explained later that he had two reasons for doing it. It gave customers something to do during the wait, and because the salad bar sat open to the kitchen, customers could actually watch their food being prepared while they filled their plates. That idea, simple as it sounds now, was genuinely new in 1966, and it became one of the most copied features in the history of American dining. The restaurant also introduced something else that's stuck around in nearly every casual restaurant since. The server walking up to your table and saying, "Hi, my name is, and I'll be your waiter tonight." Before Steak and Ale, that kind of personal introduction from a server simply wasn't standard practice. The dining room itself looked nothing like a typical steakhouse from that era. Steak and Ale built its restaurants with rustic, dimly lit rooms, stucco walls, exposed wood beams, and touches of stained glass scattered throughout. It felt warmer and more relaxed than a formal steakhouse, but still nicer than anywhere you'd grab a quick burger. The menu matched that in-between feeling exactly, with herb-roasted prime rib as the dish the chain became best known for, alongside the Kensington Club, New York Strip, filet mignon, and Hawaiian chicken. Most dinner entrees came with that unlimited salad bar or a bowl of soup, plus free refills on your drink, and a basket of honey wheat bread that regulars still bring up decades later. You weren't paying fine dining prices, but you weren't settling for fast food either. Brinker had found the exact gap nobody else had filled yet. The chain grew fast enough that other restaurant owners across the country started paying close attention to what Brinker was building. By 1971, Steak and Ale had grown to 28 locations and issued a public stock offering. By 1976, just 10 years after that first restaurant opened in Dallas, the chain had grown to 109 locations and had introduced an entire generation of American diners to the concept of casual dining itself, a category that simply didn't exist in the same form before Steak and Ale created it. That same year, Brinker sold the company to the Pillsbury Corporation for roughly $100 million, taking a position as an executive within Pillsbury's restaurant division. He didn't stop building after the sale. While working for Pillsbury, he opened the first Bennigan's, applying many of the same lessons he'd learned running Steak and Ale to an entirely new chain. Brinker's influence reached far beyond the restaurants he personally owned. Steak and Ale became something close to a training ground for the entire casual dining industry. The founders of Chuck E. Cheese, TGI Fridays, and Outback Steakhouse all learned the business under Brinker at some point in their careers, and they reportedly still came to him with questions, even after they'd gone on to build chains that competed directly with his own. In 1983, Brinker bought a small 28-unit gourmet burger chain out of Dallas called Chili's, and using the same instincts he'd sharpened at Steak and Ale, he grew that chain into Brinker International, a company that today operates more than 1,600 restaurants across 28 countries, including Chili's and Maggiano's Little Italy. The chain Brinker had built first didn't fare as well once it was no longer his to run. Steak and Ale and Bennigan's were eventually sold to the Metro Media Restaurant Group in 1993. By then, the casual dining style Steak and Ale had pioneered had become completely ordinary, found at nearly every restaurant chain in the country, and American eating habits were shifting away from the heavy meat and potatoes meals that had defined the brand for decades. Through the 1990s and 2000s, locations closed gradually as the chain struggled to feel special in a market it had practically invented, but could no longer stand out within. The end came suddenly, without much warning at all. In July of 2008, the company that owns Steak and Ale, called S&A Restaurant Group, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. On July 29, 2008, all 58 remaining Steak and Ale locations closed their doors permanently, the same day that company-owned Bennigan's locations also shut down, though franchised Bennigan's restaurants stayed open under separate ownership. There was no slow wind-down, no farewell tour. Customers who'd eaten there regularly simply found the doors locked one day, with no warning that it was happening. Norman Brinker didn't live to see his original creation come back. He died in 2009 from complications of pneumonia, just a year after the brand he'd built in 1966 disappeared overnight. But the name didn't stay gone forever. In 2015, Paul and Gwen Mangiamele bought the rights to both Bennigan's and Steak and Ale, working through a company called Legendary Restaurant Brands. They got Bennigan's running again by 2018, but Steak and Ale took longer to bring back, in part because finding the right franchise partner proved difficult. On July 8, 2024, 16 years after the bankruptcy closed every location, the first new Steak and Ale opened in Burnsville, Minnesota, with the same unlimited salad bar fans had been asking for the entire time it was gone, and the same herb-roasted prime rib that had defined the menu since Brinker first opened the doors in Dallas. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that didn't get its name from a restaurant idea at all, but from the man who owned it, a former NFL captain for the Baltimore Colts, who decided fast food might be worth trying after football. 11. Geno's Hamburgers. You ordered a Geno's Giant from a man who'd spent his Sundays sacking quarterbacks for the Baltimore Colts. Geno's Hamburgers opened its first location in 1957 in Dundalk, Maryland, just outside Baltimore, started by a small group of friends including Joe Campanella and Louis Fisher. The restaurant didn't carry the Geno's name from day one. That came 2 years later, in 1959, when the original owners invited the Colts team captain, Gino Marchetti, to join them as a partner, along with fellow Colts running back Alan Ameche. Marchetti wasn't just lending his name to the business as a quiet investor. His grandson later described him as a hands-on owner, the kind of man you'd find standing in the kitchen helping cook burgers and getting the food consistent, the same intensity he'd brought to the football field for years. The man behind the burgers had already lived a life most people couldn't imagine before he ever flipped a patty. Marchetti was born in West Virginia to Italian immigrant parents. At just 17 years old, he fought as a machine gunner during the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. After the war, he played college football at the University of San Francisco, where, as team captain in 1951, he refused to play in the Orange Bowl because 2 of his black teammates weren't allowed to take the field alongside him. He went on to a 13-season career with the Baltimore Colts, winning NFL championships in 1958 and 1959, and was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1972. He played the burger business with the same kind of seriousness he'd brought to every other part of his life. The Giant was the burger everybody asked for by name. Geno's menu centered around the Geno Giant, a burger built to compete head-on with McDonald's Big Mac, made with 2 patties of fresh ground beef, melted cheese, pickle, and shredded lettuce on a double-decked seeded roll, topped with what the chain called its gourmet sauce. The Sirloiner, made from real sirloin steak, gave customers a more upscale option, and the chain also built a name for itself selling fried chicken, since Geno's held the Kentucky Fried Chicken franchise rights across much of the Mid-Atlantic region for years. A 1960s newspaper ad promised a meal for 5 people for $1.75, with burgers running 15 cents and fries and drinks at 10 cents each. The chain's jingle, played constantly on local radio, told you exactly what to expect. Everybody goes to Geno's, 'cause Geno's is the place to go. You knew Geno's was growing because you kept seeing it pop up in towns it hadn't reached the year before. By 1969, Geno's had grown to about 100 locations. That number kept climbing through the early 1970s, reaching roughly 330 restaurants by 1972, and continuing upward until the chain peaked at around 359 company-owned locations by 1978. In 1967, Geno's merged with Tops Drive-In, a chain of 18 drive-in restaurants in the Washington, D.C. area, with most of those Tops locations getting rebranded under the Geno's name. Unlike many fast food chains of that era, Geno's didn't franchise its restaurants out to independent owners. Every single location was owned and operated directly by the company itself, which gave Marchetti and his partners tighter control over how consistent the food stayed from one Geno's to the next. Geno's tried to grow past its home turf, and the results outside the Mid-Atlantic told a clear story. When the chain pushed into Massachusetts and Connecticut, it ran into a problem that simply didn't exist back home. Gino Marchetti's name carried weight in Baltimore and Philadelphia, where football fans recognized him instantly, but in New England he was a relative unknown. Worse, customers up there kept confusing Geno's Hamburgers with Papa Gino's, an entirely different pizza chain based in Massachusetts. Those locations struggled and eventually closed, with many of the old buildings later turned into other restaurants, Burger King among them. The lesson was clear enough. Geno's worked when people knew the name behind it. It struggled the moment that recognition disappeared. In 1976, Geno's pulled its signature burger off the menu entirely, then brought it back with one of the more memorable promotional moves of the decade. When Geno's reintroduced the Geno Giant, The company brought in Muhammad Ali to announce its return in a television commercial, a level of star power that says plenty about how much weight the burger still carried with customers, even after a brief disappearance. The chain also dabbled in other businesses during this stretch, including buying the Rustler Steakhouse chain, started by original Geno's co-founder Joe Campanella after he'd left the company back in 1963 to build his own restaurant concept. By 1982, the company that had grown out of a Baltimore Colts locker room was ready for new ownership, and the buyer had different plans for the name on the sign. The Marriott Corporation bought Geno's in February of 1982 for roughly $48 million. Rather than keeping the Geno's name running, Marriott spent the next few years converting the majority of those 359 locations into a different chain entirely, Roy Rogers Restaurants, a brand Marriott already owned and wanted to grow. Some menu items carried over into the new restaurants, including roast beef sandwiches and fried chicken, but Geno's signature burger and the name itself were phased out for good. A smaller number of locations were sold off or converted to other concepts, including some that became Kentucky Fried Chicken outlets outright. The very last independently owned Geno's, located in Pasadena, Maryland, finally closed in 1991, nearly a decade after Marriott's purchase had already ended the chain everywhere else. The name didn't stay buried forever. In 2009, Gino Marchetti partnered with former longtime Geno's employees, including Tom Romano, who had served as the company's chief operating officer back when it was sold in 1982, to bring the brand back under a new name, Geno's Burgers and Chicken. The first new location opened on October 25, 2010, in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, the same town where the original chain had once kept its headquarters. Marchetti, by then well into his 80s, served as a consultant to the revival before he passed away in 2019 at the age of 93. Several of the new locations eventually closed over the following years, but at least one, in Towson, Maryland, has continued carrying the Geno's name forward, more than 60 years after a group of football players first decided that selling hamburgers might be worth trying. There's another one coming up that tried the exact same trick of borrowing a famous name for its restaurants, except this time the famous name belonged to a comedian from the Grand Ole Opry, and the restaurant itself never came close to catching up with the fried chicken brand it was trying to copy. 12. Minnie Pearl's Chicken. You ordered fried chicken from a restaurant named after a Grand Ole Opry comedian because a Nashville lawyer thought her hat and her catchphrase might be worth more than any actual chicken recipe. In 1966, a Nashville attorney named John J. Hooker ran for governor of Tennessee and lost the Democratic primary. Around that same time, he noticed something that caught his attention completely. A Nashville businessman named Jack Massey had bought control of Kentucky Fried Chicken, paired with a young lawyer named John Y. Brown, and neither one of them had any real food business experience before that. Wall Street couldn't get enough of the stock anyway. Hooker watched his own brother, Henry Hooker, call in an order to buy 10,000 shares over the phone, and when John J. asked what a PE ratio even was, Henry realized his brother had no idea what he'd just watched happen. That conversation planted the idea. If two lawyers with no restaurant experience could build a fortune selling fried chicken stock, John J. figured he and Henry could do the same thing. The chicken itself wasn't the starting point. The recipe came second, and the famous name came first. Hooker and his brother approached Sarah Ophelia Colley Cannon, the comedian known across the country by her stage name, Minnie Pearl, a fixture at the Grand Ole Opry since 1940, and, starting in 1969, a regular face on the television show Hee Haw. Her character wore a straw hat with a price tag dangling from it and greeted audiences with a drawn-out howdy, a bit of gentle, affectionate comedy built around small-town Southern life. The Hookers convinced her to lend her name and image to a fried chicken chain meant to go head-to-head with Kentucky Fried Chicken directly. Once Cannon agreed, the brothers hired the Griffin Food Laboratories in Chicago, the same kind of food chemists a company might use to develop a soft drink formula, and asked them to come up with a recipe John J. described as being as good, or better, than Kentucky Fried Chicken. Notice the order of operations there. The famous spokesperson and the corporate structure came together before a single piece of chicken had ever actually been fried and sold to a paying customer. The restaurants themselves looked like something you might mistake for a small church from across the parking lot. Minnie Pearl's fried chicken locations were designed by architect DeBarry McKissick with white brick exteriors and a peaked roof, a style that genuinely resembled a modest, modern church building far more than it resembled a typical fast food restaurant of that era. Inside, the menu leaned hard into Southern comfort cooking, with fried chicken as the centerpiece, alongside rolls, mashed potatoes and gravy, chicken livers, gizzards, beans, and coleslaw. Some locations also served catfish and a specialty item called a soul bowl, along with sweet potato pie for dessert. The chain found its strongest footing in the South and the Midwest, with outlets eventually opening in cities including Chicago, Memphis, Cleveland, Detroit, Jacksonville, and Dallas. You'd have seen ads for Minnie Pearl's Chicken long before you ever found a location actually open and serving food. The Hookers built their company, called Performance Systems Inc., around selling franchises aggressively before the restaurants behind those franchises had actually been built. By 1968, the brothers had sold the rights to roughly 300 franchise stores, but only about 5 restaurants were actually open and operating. That gap between franchises sold and restaurants running didn't stop the company from going public that same year. The stock opened somewhere around $20 a share and climbed past $40 within a short stretch, even though, again, there were only a handful of restaurants you could actually walk into and order from at that point. John J. Hooker later described his own pitch to prospective franchisees with a blunt comparison. They deliberately opened their very first Nashville location in a mediocre spot, rated somewhere around a 6 or 7 out of 10 for location quality, specifically so that when a prospective franchisee toured it and saw it doing decent business anyway, they'd assume their own, presumably better, location back home would do even better. The company didn't stop at one celebrity chicken chain. It tried to build an entire empire of them at once. Not long after launching Minnie Pearl's, the Hookers announced a second chain, this one built around gospel singer Mahalia Jackson's name, also centered on fried chicken. Before that news had even fully settled with investors, they announced yet a third concept, Minnie Pearl's roast beef, stacking new ventures on top of each other faster than any of them could realistically be built out and proven profitable. The stock price kept climbing through all of this anyway, reaching as high as $56 a share at one point, even as the company's actual restaurant count stayed stubbornly small. By the end of 1968, Minnie Pearl's still had fewer than 40 restaurants open in total, and none of them were turning a profit. The way the company counted its own money is where the real trouble started. Performance Systems Inc. recorded the entire fee from every franchise sale as income on the very day that franchise was sold, even though franchisees typically only made a partial down payment and financed the rest of the cost through promissory notes paid over time. John J. Hooker later said he personally viewed this accounting method as a death trap and opposed it internally, but the company's accountants at Price Waterhouse had recommended exactly this approach, and Henry Hooker pushed hard to keep using it, even sending the Nashville office of Price Waterhouse to argue the company's case directly with the firm's main office in New York. The practical effect was straightforward enough to explain simply. The company was booking money as profit today for chicken restaurants that might not generate a single dollar of actual revenue for years, if those franchised locations ever opened and succeeded at all. By 1969, the gap between what the company was reporting and what was actually happening inside the business had grown too large to hide. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission announced a formal investigation into Performance Systems Inc. that year, focused on the company's accounting practices around franchise fee income. Sources differ on exactly how the SEC characterized the underlying issue. Some accounts describe the company's 1968 annual report as having been falsified to show profit where losses actually existed, while other reporting and Hooker's own later account framed the dispute more narrowly around the franchise fee accounting method itself, a method the company eventually agreed to stop using under a formal consent decree without admitting any deliberate fraud. What's not in dispute is what happened to the stock once the investigation became public. Shares that had traded as high as $40 to $56 collapsed down to around 50 cents apiece. By the middle of 1969, the company itself reported losses of $5.5 million for just the first 6 months of that year alone. The investigation dragged on for roughly 3 years before it finally wound down, and by the time it did, there wasn't much company left standing. John J. Hooker was never criminally convicted of any wrongdoing connected to the Minnie Pearl's chicken case, and the SEC's investigation specifically cleared both Sarah Cannon and Mahalia Jackson of any financial wrongdoing, though both women were embarrassed by all the negative publicity that came along with simply having lent their names to the venture. The damage to the underlying business, however, was already done. Performance Systems Inc. effectively liquidated as a result of the prolonged investigation, though a small number of individual outlets managed to keep operating independently well into the 1980s, run by franchisees who'd built local followings strong enough to survive on their own, separate from whatever was happening at the corporate level above them. The collapse reached well beyond the restaurant business itself and followed John J. Hooker directly into his next run for office. In 1970, while the SEC investigation was still actively unfolding and the stock was already in freefall, Hooker ran for governor of Tennessee a second time. He managed to win the Democratic primary that year, but went on to lose the general election to a Memphis dentist named Winfield Dunn, who became Tennessee's first Republican governor in more than 50 years. Hooker maintained for the rest of his life that the entire SEC investigation had been politically motivated, aimed at damaging his reputation and that of his political ally, Senator Albert Gore Sr., as part of a broader strategy by the Nixon administration to weaken anti-war Democrats across the South. Other Nashville business figures who watched the whole episode unfold from up close offered a different, simpler explanation, suggesting that any stock rising as fast as Minnie Pearl's did on the strength of a celebrity endorsement and aggressive franchising alone was always going to attract regulatory scrutiny eventually, regardless of who happened to be in the White House at the time. Hooker himself didn't disappear from public life after the collapse. He went on to serve as publisher of the Nashville Banner, the same newspaper that had once criticized him harshly, became chairman of both United Press International and the STP Fuel Additive Company, and even started a double drive-through hamburger chain called Hooker's Hamburgers in the 1980s, which he eventually sold. He spent his later decades filing lawsuits over Tennessee campaign finance laws, still describing the Minnie Pearl episode decades later as something that haunted him, not because of the money he'd lost, but because of what it had done to his reputation for honesty. People who actually ate at Minnie Pearl's locations during the years it operated didn't necessarily remember the chicken itself as anything extraordinary. What people who grew up near one of those white brick, church-shaped restaurants remember instead is the idea behind it, the strange, specific thrill of eating fried chicken named after a beloved comedian whose voice they already knew from the radio and from television, in a fast food landscape that, for a few short years in the late 1960s, genuinely believed a famous enough name could substitute for a restaurant's actual recipe. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that didn't fall apart over an accounting scandal or a celebrity endorsement gone wrong. It simply ran out of room to survive once the chains with deeper pockets moved into its own backyard, the same fate that had already caught up with more than one regional chain on this list. 13. Winkies. You knew the Big Wink before you knew the Big Mac, and depending on where you grew up, the order of those two burgers in your life might say a lot about you. Winkies started as a side project from a meat company. Two brothers, Harold and Bernard Ehrenstein, had started the Jiffy Steak Company in the back of their family's grocery store in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, right after World War II ended. By 1962, the brothers decided to open their own hamburger stand, partly so Jiffy Steak would have a guaranteed buyer for the beef it was already supplying to other restaurants. The first Winkies opened in February of 1962, with most sources placing it in either Bridgeville or nearby Sewickley, Pennsylvania, both small towns outside Pittsburgh. The opening menu kept things plain and cheap. 15-cent hamburgers were the headline, and the chain's own connection to Jiffy Steak meant Winkies controlled its own meat supply from the very beginning, a real advantage most small burger stands at the time simply didn't have. The growth came faster than two brothers running a meat company probably expected. By 1965, just 3 years after that first location opened, Winkies had already grown to 14 restaurants, with 4 more under construction. 2 years after that, the chain had reached 32 locations around the Pittsburgh area, with 9 additional restaurants being built and serious talk underway about expanding the chain nationally through franchising. Company president Bernard Ehrenstein told a reporter in 1967 that he believed Winkies would eventually operate coast to coast. The chain settled into a peak around 1977, with 42 locations spread across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, a region people in that part of the country sometimes called the tri-state area. You ordered something called a Winky Shake, and it tasted like the best thing your 6-year-old self had ever eaten. The Winkies menu went well beyond plain hamburgers, even from the early years. The signature item was the Big Wink, a double-decker burger built on a 3-piece bun with 2 beef patties, 2 slices of American cheese, fresh-made coleslaw, and the chain's own tartar sauce, all for under $1. Other menu names included the Great One and the Ground Rounder, alongside hot dogs, fish sandwiches priced at 19 cents, fish dinners, fried chicken dinners, milkshakes called Winky Shakes, full breakfasts, and even freshly fried cinnamon sugar donuts. Winky's claims to have been the first fast food chain in its home region to sell several of those items, though McDonald's had already beaten every regional chain to the national fish sandwich race with its Filet-O-Fish back in 1962. The mascot on television looked like he'd wandered off the set of a children's show and never found his way back. Winky's built its local advertising around a puppet named Winker, described by people who remembered the commercials as pinkish, hairy, and more than a little ragged-looking. The kind of low-budget puppet that clearly wasn't competing with anything Sesame Street was putting out at the time. In one commercial, Winker read off a list of town names where Winky's had locations, and upon discovering there was no Winky's in the town of Wilmerding, the puppet ate the sign panel entirely, shouting that there's no Winky's in Wilmerding. The whole production had a rough, homemade quality to it, but it stuck in people's memories anyway. Pittsburgh Pirates star Willie Stargell also appeared in Winky's advertisements over the years, including a later commercial promoting the chain's fried chicken under the name Willie's 4-Star Chicken, and Stargell himself recalled describing the 89-cent Big Wink combo as a grand slam. Here's the detail that connects Winky's directly to one of the most famous hamburgers in American history. A man named Jim Delegati once owned a Winky's restaurant before he went on to become a McDonald's franchisee himself. Years later, working as a McDonald's franchise owner in the Pittsburgh area, Delegati is credited as the creator of the Big Mac, the double-decker burger that became one of the most recognizable items McDonald's ever sold. Winky's had already been selling its own double-decker burger, the Big Wink, for several years by that point, built with the same basic two-patty, multiple-layer concept that the Big Mac would later make famous nationwide. Whether that connection was coincidence or direct inspiration, the timeline lines up close enough that the comparison gets brought up regularly by people who remember both chains. The same city that built Winky's into a regional success eventually pulled the ground out from underneath it. Through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, the Pittsburgh region went through one of the steepest economic collapses any American city experienced in that era, driven by the rapid decline of the steel industry that the city had depended on for generations. More than 150,000 jobs disappeared from the region during that downturn. With that much of the local population suddenly out of steady work, spending money on a hamburger and fries at a regional chain became a much harder thing to justify for a lot of families who had once eaten there regularly. At the exact same time, Winky's was facing pressure from a completely different direction, as McDonald's, Burger King, and the newer Wendy's chain fought an increasingly aggressive national advertising war against each other. A fight with budgets no regional chain built around one family's meat company could realistically match. By the early 1980s, Winky's had piled up debts reported at more than $500,000, and the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in February of 1982. A bankruptcy judge approved a plan roughly a year later that was meant to let the company repay its creditors while continuing to operate. Winky's even ran a newspaper advertisement at the time, insisting the chain intended to keep going despite the bankruptcy filing. That promise didn't hold. The company began cutting costs and closing its weakest locations first, but the slide never reversed. Within a relatively short stretch after the bankruptcy filing, every remaining Winky's restaurant had closed for good, 20 years after that first 15-cent hamburger went out the window in 1962. What's left of Winky's today exists mostly in memory and in old photographs traded among people who grew up in western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio, and the part of West Virginia the chain once reached. Vintage Winky's signs and menus still circulate among collectors who specialize in regional fast food memorabilia. People who ate there as kids still bring up the exact same details when the chain comes up: the Winky Shake, the size of the Big Wink compared to a child's appetite, and that strange, scruffy puppet insisting there was no Winky's in Wilmerding. None of those details made Winky's a national name the way Bernard Ehrenstein had once predicted it would become. They just made it the kind of restaurant a very specific stretch of the country still hasn't fully let go of. There's another one coming up next that started with the name Burger Queen, 2 years after Burger King had already claimed half the name for itself, and ended up trading its own identity away to the one company everyone confused it with from the very beginning. 14. Burger Queen. Druthers. You greeted Queenie Bee at the counter, a giant cartoon bee with a baby face and a tiny gold crown, and you trusted her completely, even though somewhere in a courtroom, lawyers from 2 other restaurant chains were arguing that her name shouldn't exist. Burger Queen began in 1956, when Harold and Helen Kite opened the first location on Havendale Boulevard in Winter Haven, Florida, just a few miles from the popular Cypress Gardens attraction. Helen ran the restaurant in person and became, in a real sense, the original Burger Queen herself, while Harold focused on the business side and sold equipment for Taylor Freezer on the side. The timing put Burger Queen just 2 years behind Burger King, which had launched in Miami in 1954, and that closeness in both name and timing would follow the smaller chain for the rest of its existence. By 1961, the Kites had grown their Florida operation to 16 locations, selling a menu built around burgers, fries, milkshakes, and fried chicken. You watched the chain leave Florida the same way a lot of regional restaurants spread in that era, through a handshake deal with men from a completely different state. In 1961, two business partners from Kentucky, George Clark and Mick Gannon, bought the franchise rights to bring Burger Queen north, with Harold Kite joining as a partner in the new venture. The first Kentucky location opened in Louisville on September 23, 1963, in the Middletown neighborhood on the east side of the city, after a soft opening for family and friends. Louisville quickly became the company's true home base, with the corporate headquarters eventually settling directly across the street from that original restaurant. Growth in Kentucky moved at a steady pace through the rest of the 1960s and into the 1970s. The company opened its 50th location in December of 1973 in Danville, Kentucky, with restaurants by then spread across Kentucky, Indiana, and Tennessee. A giant bee wearing a crown became the face of the entire company, and her arrival came after years of the chain figuring out who it actually was. In 1971, a young advertising executive named Joe Bonura created Queenie Bee for Burger Queen, and the character was introduced to the public the following year. Two actresses, Joyce Murphy and Susan Bandy, took turns playing Queenie in costume at restaurant appearances and promotional events over the years that followed. The character had a recurring villain built into her storyline too, a figure named Mr. John B. Catcher, and the company built jingles around her, including one that went, "Let's all follow Queenie Bee. It's Burger Queen for me." Joe Bonura ended up spending more than a decade working on the Burger Queen and later Druther's advertising account through his own agency, a relationship that shaped how the public saw the brand for most of the 1970s and into the early 1980s. The name Burger Queen sounded close enough to two much bigger companies that lawyers got involved more than once. In 1970, American Dairy Queen filed a lawsuit against Burger Queen, alleging that using the word Queen in its name and advertising infringed on 14 of Dairy Queen's trademarks. The lawsuit asked the court to stop Burger Queen from using the word at all and to destroy any advertising material containing it, along with seeking damages. Burger Queen kept operating and kept fighting the case through most of the decade before it was eventually settled, though the settlement barred the company from selling ice cream and other dairy products under its own name, a restriction that, looking back, feels almost like foreshadowing given what eventually happened to the company decades later. Burger King separately pursued its own legal challenge against the Burger Queen trademark, a dispute that dragged on for roughly 2 decades before Burger King finally dropped the fight. When Burger Queen tried to expand into the United Kingdom, British franchise partners advised against using the name Queen at all, given the obvious sensitivity around the country's actual reigning monarch at the time, so the chain operated under the name Huckleberries in England instead. By the late 1970s, the company had grown well past Kentucky's borders, but the burger in its own name had started to feel like a problem rather than an asset. Burger Queen executives Tom Hensley and Robert Gatewood became more deeply involved in running the company during this stretch, eventually acquiring it outright from Harold Kite and George Clark. By 1981, the chain operated somewhere between 171 and over 200 company-owned and franchised locations spread across 7 U.S. states, with additional franchised locations operating in England, Canada, the Republic of China, and the United Arab Emirates. Despite the word burger sitting right in the company's name, hamburgers had fallen to less than a quarter of the chain's actual business by that point, with fried chicken and a serve-yourself salad bar making up a much larger share of what customers were actually ordering. Tom Hensley later explained that the old name put far too much emphasis on burgers alone, when the menu itself had grown into something much broader. You watched the sign outside your local restaurant change overnight, and the food underneath it stayed almost exactly the same. In June of 1981, the company announced it was changing its name entirely, from Burger Queen Enterprises Inc. to Druther's International Inc., with every individual restaurant switching its sign from Burger Queen to Druther's Restaurant. The new name played on the old-fashioned word Druthers, paired with a new slogan, "I'd ruther go to Druthers Restaurant." The rebrand brought in a new mascot too, a folksy character named Andy Dandytail, created by the Grey Advertising Agency, replacing Queenie Bee, who was phased out gradually as the transition took hold. Despite the entirely new name, new mascot, and new signage, the management running the company and the actual menu customers ordered from stayed essentially unchanged. The rebrand itself was expensive enough that company executives later said it nearly bankrupted the business, even though operations were holding up reasonably well as 1981 began. The new name didn't solve the underlying competitive problem that had been building against the chain for years. Through the 1980s, Druther's struggled against the same wave of national fast food expansion that had already worn down so many other regional chains across the country. Locations closed steadily through the decade, and by the early 1990s, the company had shrunk down to 145 restaurants, almost entirely concentrated in small towns across Kentucky and the surrounding states. In September of 1990, Druthers International signed an agreement with Dairy Queen, the very company that had sued it 20 years earlier over the word Queen, to become a territory operator for the Dairy Queen brand. Over the following months, Druthers converted the large majority of its remaining restaurants into Dairy Queen locations, completing most of that switch by the end of the first quarter of 1991. One detail from this period stuck around longer than the Druthers name itself did. Druthers had been offering a full breakfast menu at its restaurants for years before the conversion, and that breakfast program became the basis for the broader breakfast offerings Dairy Queen eventually rolled out across many of its own locations nationwide. In 1996, International Dairy Queen Inc. purchased 31 Dairy Queen and Brazier outlets across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana directly from Druthers Systems Inc., another step in the long process of the original Burger Queen chain, folding itself into the much larger company it had once been sued by. Former Druthers buildings around Louisville now house all kinds of other businesses, including at least one Burger King location, the very chain that had spent 2 decades fighting Burger Queen over its name in the first place, and a liquor store. Today, exactly one independently owned Druthers restaurant remains in operation, located in Campbellsville, Kentucky, where it celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2020. A small number of Burger Queen locations, operating completely independently from the original American company at this point, have also continued running in Taiwan. What started as one couple's drive-in restaurant in Winter Haven, Florida in 1956, run under a name that drew lawsuits from 2 much bigger competitors over the decades, ended up surviving in 2 completely different countries, under 2 completely different identities, neither of which has the word Queen in it at all anymore. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up next that started as a single hot dog and taco stand in Pasadena, California, run by a man who'd already built one small chain of donut stands before he ever thought to put a hot dog and a taco on the same menu. 15. Puppin Taco. You ordered a chili dog and a taco from the same window, and back in the 1950s, almost nowhere else in the country let you do that. Puppin Taco began in 1956, started by an entrepreneur named Russell Wendell as a drive-in restaurant that served tacos, hot dogs, and pastrami sandwiches, all under one roof. Wendell wasn't new to the restaurant business when he started this one. He had already built a successful chain of donut stores around Los Angeles called Big Donut, known for giant oversized donut sculptures perched on top of drive-in bakeries. One of those buildings, designed by architect Henry J. Goodwin as the second of 10 Big Donut locations, eventually became famous on its own under different ownership, recognized today as the Giant Rooftop Donut at what's now Randy's Donuts, a building Wendell built before he ever sold the chain and turned his full attention to hot dogs and tacos instead. The name itself told you exactly what you were getting before you ever looked at the menu board. The first officially branded Puppin Taco opened in Pasadena, California in 1965, with the pup referring directly to the hot dogs on the menu and the taco referring to, well, the tacos. Beyond those 2 headline items, the restaurant served tostadas, pastrami sandwiches topped with lettuce, tomatoes, guacamole, and chiles, burgers, and French fries, along with a drink lineup that included RC Cola, root beer, and slushes in flavors like cherry, grape, and orange. Prices started impossibly low. One longtime employee remembered the original sign featuring a giant 15-cent price tag that practically outshined the actual restaurant name itself, since 15 cents bought you the town's best chili dog or taco in those early years. The combination sounds unusual on paper. Hot dogs and tacos sharing a menu with pastrami sandwiches. But it reflected exactly the kind of mixed, layered food culture that Southern California had been building for decades. With Jewish delicatessens, Mexican taco stands, and classic American burger joints, all sitting within a few blocks of each other in the same neighborhoods. The buildings themselves were just as memorable to regulars as anything coming out of the kitchen. Russ Wendell designed many of the actual restaurant buildings himself, giving Puppin Taco a distinctive look built around orange roofs and playful, eye-catching signage that fit right into the fun, casual identity of Southern California's car culture in that era. The chain ran as a drive-in and later a drive-through operation, built around quick service for customers who mostly never left their cars, with limited indoor seating that kept the focus on speed and turnover rather than sit-down dining. Growth came fast once the Pasadena location proved the idea could work as a standalone restaurant chain, separate from Wendell's donut business. By January of 1972, Puppin Taco had grown to 50 locations. Just 1 year later, that number had climbed to 62. The chain kept expanding through the rest of the 1970s, eventually reaching somewhere between 100 and 108 locations at its peak, spread mostly across Southern California, but also stretching into Albuquerque, New Mexico. The chain became enough of a Southern California fixture that comedian Johnny Carson reportedly mentioned its name in his monologues on The Tonight Show during the 1970s and 1980s, and the restaurant even made an appearance in the 1985 comedy film Fletch, starring Chevy Chase, a small but genuine sign of how recognizable the name had become within its home region by that point. By the early 1980s, a much bigger taco company had started circling Puppin Taco for reasons that had less to do with the food and more to do with where the restaurants happened to be sitting. Taco Bell, owned by PepsiCo at the time, had grown to roughly 1,800 locations across the country, dwarfing Puppin Taco's 100 or so restaurants by a wide margin. In 1984, Taco Bell purchased 99 of Puppin Taco's locations, reportedly for somewhere around $50 million. A deal driven primarily by the value of the real estate those restaurants sat on, rather than any interest in keeping the Puppin Taco menu or brand running. Most of the purchased locations were converted directly into Taco Bell restaurants, sometimes within a matter of weeks, erasing the orange roofs and the chili dog signage that had defined the chain for nearly 2 decades. 3 locations escaped that fate entirely, simply because of where they happened to be. The deal with Taco Bell didn't include 3 Puppin Taco restaurants operating in Albuquerque, New Mexico, far outside the chain's core Southern California territory. Those 3 locations kept running independently after 1984, changing their name slightly to Puppin Taco, rather than continuing to use the Puppin Taco name that Taco Bell now controlled. At least 2 of those Albuquerque restaurants managed to stay open for nearly 30 more years after the original chain's collapse, finally closing sometime around 2013, making them the last living pieces of a restaurant concept that had otherwise disappeared completely from the landscape in a single year. People who grew up eating at Puppin Taco in Southern California still bring up the same specific details whenever the chain comes up in conversation: the pastrami sandwiches piled high with guacamole, the chili dogs that some longtime customers insist were simply better than anything Taco Bell ever managed to put together afterward, and the strange, slightly funny relief of pulling up to a drive-through window where you could order a hot dog and a taco in the very same breath, without anyone behind the counter blinking at the combination. Russell Wendell built 2 separate visual icons of Southern California fast food during his career: the giant donut sculpture that still draws tourists today under the Randy's name, and the orange-roofed buildings that once told an entire region exactly where to find a chili dog and a taco served from the same window. Only one of those 2 icons is still standing today, and it isn't the one with his original name attached to it. There's another one coming up next that didn't get bought out for its real estate at all. It collapsed instead after its own founder got caught up in financial scandals that had nothing to do with hamburgers, charbroiled or otherwise. 16. All-American Burger. You watched a movie character get fired from this exact burger stand, and for a lot of people, that brief movie scene is the only reason they remember the chain existed at all. All-American Burger was founded in 1968 by a man named Aaron Binder, operating as a small regional chain in Los Angeles, California. The restaurant built its menu around a quarter-pound burger patty, along with a chili burger and a hickory burger, and it also sold a half-pound version that reportedly accounted for as much as a quarter of total sales at some locations. Binder opened several more restaurants around Los Angeles through the 1970s, expanding the chain enough that it eventually grew large enough to purchase other smaller chains during that decade, building out a real, if modest, footprint across the west side of the city. The look of the restaurant fit right into the easygoing, drive-in feel that defined a lot of Southern California fast food at the time. All-American Burger ran with the kind of bright, family-friendly drive-in atmosphere that customers across Los Angeles had come to expect from the smaller regional chains competing alongside McDonald's and Burger King in that era. The food itself leaned into simple, no-nonsense American comfort cooking. The quarter pounder, the chili burger, the hickory burger, items that didn't try to reinvent the hamburger so much as just deliver a solid, reliable version of it. You'd actually seen this exact restaurant before, even if you've never realized it. The All-American Burger on Sunset Boulevard became the location used for a memorable scene in the 1982 coming-of-age film, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, where the character Brad Hamilton, played by Judge Reinhold, works behind the counter and ends up getting fired in his fast food uniform. That single scene gave the chain a small but lasting place in pop culture history, recognized today by people who've never set foot in Los Angeles and have no idea the restaurant in the movie was a real, working chain, with multiple locations across the city at the time the film was shot. The man who built the chain stepped away from running it not long before everything started falling apart. Aaron Binder led the company until January of 1980, then stayed on as a member of its board of directors for a little over another year, finally leaving that position in March of 1981. The timing turned out to matter quite a bit. Just 1 month after Binder left the board entirely, in April of 1981, All-American Burger filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The bankruptcy itself turned out to be only the first piece of bad news connected to the chain that year. A few months after the bankruptcy filing, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission accused Aaron Binder of selling his own stock in the company while he knew, but the public didn't yet know, that the business was already insolvent. That kind of allegation, trading shares based on information the rest of the market didn't have access to yet, is taken seriously by regulators because it gives an insider an unfair advantage over everyone else holding or buying that same stock. The case against Binder was eventually settled out of court, with Binder neither admitting nor denying that he had done anything wrong, a common outcome in SEC settlements that lets a case close without a formal finding of guilt. Binder's troubles with financial regulators didn't end with All-American Burger either. In a completely separate and unrelated matter, he became involved in 1983 with a scheme connected to defrauding investors and the IRS through a short-lived package delivery company based in Illinois, a venture that had nothing to do with hamburgers or the restaurant business he'd built his name on through the 1970s. Most of the All-American Burger locations closed down in the years following the 1981 bankruptcy filing, as the chain that had once grown large enough to acquire other smaller restaurant companies found itself unable to recover from the combination of the bankruptcy and the cloud of scandal hanging over its own founder. One location, the very same Sunset Boulevard restaurant that had appeared in Fast Times at Ridgemont High, managed to keep its doors open far longer than any of the other locations, becoming something of a lone survivor that outlasted the rest of the chain by decades, finally closing sometime in the years that followed, well after most people had forgotten the company behind it had ever filed for bankruptcy or attracted attention from federal regulators. What's left of All-American Burger today exists mostly in the memory of people who grew up eating quarter pounders and chili burgers on the west side of Los Angeles, and in the brief flicker of recognition some viewers get watching an old VHS copy of Fast Times at Ridgemont High, realizing the burger stand in the background of one scene was a real place, with a real and fairly complicated story behind why it eventually disappeared from the city it once called home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up that tried to sell America on the idea that fast food could actually be good for you, years before anyone else seriously thought a burger chain and a diet plan belonged on the same menu. 17. Delights. You walked into a fast food restaurant in the early 1980s and found a salad bar standing next to a counter that also served light beer, and somehow the whole combination made perfect sense for that particular decade. Delights of America was founded by Doug Shealy and Jeffrey Miller in 1978, with Sheely bringing real fast food experience to the table as a former successful Wendy's franchise owner from Iowa. The company didn't open its first actual restaurant right away. The first Delights location opened in Norcross, Georgia, just outside Atlanta, in December of 1981, built around a single, clear idea that nobody else in fast food had really tried to build an entire restaurant around yet. Sheely wanted to take the format everyone already knew: a counter, a menu board, a drive-through window, and fill it with food built specifically for people trying to eat healthier. At the exact moment the country was deep into an aerobics and fitness craze that had people showing up to workout classes in shiny leotards and tube socks. The menu looked like a fast food restaurant's menu rewritten by someone who'd just come from the gym. Delights built its food around extra lean ground beef, high-fiber multigrain buns, and low-calorie cheese, all stacked into burgers that were marketed as a genuinely lighter alternative to what you'd get at McDonald's or Burger King. Beyond the burgers, the chain offered a full salad bar, soup made from fresh ingredients rather than just reheated from a can, baked potatoes, vegetarian pita bread sandwiches, diet cheeseburgers, frozen yogurt for dessert, and even light beer on the drink menu. An unusual combination for a restaurant that otherwise looked and operated like any other fast food chain of that era. The physical buildings themselves looked a lot like a Wendy's, which made sense given Sheely's background, but the food coming out of the kitchen was built around an entirely different promise than anything Wendy's was selling at the time. The timing felt perfect, and for a few years, the growth numbers backed that feeling up completely. Founder Doug Sheely made a bold public prediction early on, telling people he expected to grow Delights to 1,000 locations and $1 billion in sales by 1991. The company expanded fast enough in its early years to make that prediction sound at least plausible. By 1983, the chain had begun selling franchises for the first time, and growth accelerated quickly from there. By 1985, sales had doubled from the year before, and the chain had grown past 100 operating restaurants spread across 19 states, while also selling franchise and development rights for as many as 836 additional locations that hadn't opened yet. In September of 1984, the company went public, and its stock price jumped on its very first day of trading, a clear sign that investors believed in the same fitness-driven future Sheely was betting on. Bigger chains noticed what Delights was doing and scrambled to copy pieces of it almost immediately. Wendy's rolled out a multigrain bun of its own not long after Delights started gaining attention. Burger King experimented with a low-sodium pickle. McDonald's went so far as to test a lighter version of its own Big Mac. A nutritionist working for the USDA at the time was quoted saying, "Everyone was getting on the bandwagon," a comment that captured just how quickly the entire fast food industry had decided that health-conscious menu items were suddenly worth testing, largely because of the attention Delights had managed to attract in such a short window of time. The novelty that drew people in the first place turned out to be exactly that, a novelty, and it didn't hold up once the newness wore off. Customers were curious enough to try Delights once, drawn in by the idea of a fast food restaurant that wasn't actively working against their diet, but a lot of them simply didn't come back for a second or third visit the way regulars at other chains did. One franchisee later told a Florida newspaper plainly that what we found was people really don't care that much about nutrition, a blunt summary of exactly what the sales numbers ended up showing. Delights started posting financial losses in 1985, the same general period when the company should have been riding its strongest momentum yet. Taking the company public back in 1984 had shifted real decision-making power away from Sheely alone and into the hands of a board of directors, and that board reportedly struggled to agree on consistent business decisions as the losses started piling up. By 1986, the financial picture had turned from concerning into genuinely dire. Delights lost $18,700,000 during fiscal year 1986, a stark collapse from the modest profit of $948,000 the company had reported just 1 year earlier. Jefferson McMahon, a former Arby's executive who'd only been hired the previous November specifically to tighten up the company's management, abruptly quit the top job in the middle of 1986, right as the financial situation was becoming public. Doug Sheely himself had already left the company that February, with disappointed investors at the time placing much of the blame for the financial squeeze on an overheated expansion drive that Sheely had personally led during the chain's fastest growth years. The company stopped selling new franchises altogether in 1986 and began closing a number of its weaker-performing locations. By the end of that same year, Delights had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and the company formally dissolved the following year, in 1987. Most of what remained of the chain after the bankruptcy got absorbed by a much more conventional competitor. Many of the surviving Delights locations were purchased and converted directly into Hardee's restaurants, a chain actively looking to expand quickly in many of the same regions where Delights had built its locations during its brief few years of rapid growth. The salad bars, the multigrain buns, and the light beer all disappeared from those buildings, along with the Delights name itself. Doug Shealy didn't disappear from the restaurant business after the bankruptcy closed the chapter on Delights. He later went on to found a different restaurant concept called Fresh to Order, based again in Atlanta, and eventually expanding into Tennessee and North Carolina, returning once more to the same basic idea that had defined his first company: fast food built around fresher, healthier ingredients. People who worked at the original Delights locations, and customers who remember pulling up to that salad bar back when leg warmers and aerobics tapes were everywhere, still gather in online groups today, specifically to swap memories of the chain and occasionally push for someone to bring the concept back. Doug Shealy's own daughter has mentioned that her father spent time in more recent years quietly working to revive the Delights concept under a new name, suggesting that even decades after the bankruptcy, the idea that drove the original chain hadn't entirely left him. There's another one coming up next that built its entire identity around drive-thru Mexican food in Southern California, only to get absorbed by the very same company that had already swallowed up the hot dog and taco stand on this list a few sections back. 18. Noggles. You pulled into a 24-hour drive-thru at 2 in the morning after the club had let out, because there was almost nowhere else in Southern California in the 1980s that was still serving food at that hour. Noggles was founded in 1970 by a man named Dick Noggle, who had already spent years as a partner in a different taco chain, Del Taco, which itself had opened back in 1964 in Corona, California. Noggle left Del Taco to start something of his own, opening the first Noggles at the southwest corner of 14th Street and Brockton Avenue in Riverside, California, a building that today, somewhat ironically, operates as a Del Taco. Noggle ran the business by a simple, plainly stated motto: prepare food fresh, serve customer fast, keep place clean, a phrase that summed up exactly what he expected from every restaurant carrying his name. The menu blended American fast food with Mexican food in a way that felt distinctly Californian and distinctly its own. Noggles served hard-shell and soft-shell tacos, burritos topped with either red or green sauce, and a unique item called the taco burger, essentially loose taco filling served on a hamburger bun, an item later renamed the bun taco. Alongside those Mexican-inspired items, the menu also included straightforward hamburgers, milkshakes, fries, and breakfast items, plus the Ortega burger, a regular beef patty topped with pickled Ortega peppers, and Noggles taco bowls, a mix of beans and beef served alongside taco shells for dipping. The single item most people remember above everything else was the cheese burrito, a simple steamed flour tortilla filled with nothing but melted cheese and red sauce, paired with the chain's bean and cheese version that added refried beans into the same combination. The restaurant became known specifically for running a 24-hour drive-thru, one of the first fast food chains anywhere to stay open around the clock, which made it the obvious destination for anyone hungry at an hour when almost nothing else nearby was still serving food. Dick Noggle didn't stay at the helm of his own restaurant for very long before deciding to sell it. In 1979, Noggle sold the business to a restaurateur named Harold Butler, at a point when the chain still consisted of only 3 locations. Under Butler's ownership, Noggles expanded through a system of non-exclusive franchises, an arrangement that a federal court later ruled was actually unlawful. Regardless of that legal complication, the chain grew fast under Butler's direction, reaching somewhere between 225 and 275 locations by the mid-1980s, spread mostly across Southern California, but stretching as far as Nevada, Utah, and even the St. Louis metropolitan area in Missouri. In 1984, Butler sold the chain to a company called Collins Foods International. The fate that eventually caught up with Noggles was strikingly similar to what had already happened to another taco chain on this very list. In 1988, an Orange County businessman named Anwar Solomon purchased both Noggles and Del Taco at nearly the same time, bringing Noggles' original restaurant and the chain he'd once worked for back under the very same corporate roof, decades after Noggle had left Del Taco to build a competitor in the first place. A handful of popular Noggles menu items carrying the chain's macho designation found their way directly onto the regular Del Taco menu following the merger. In May of 1989, Soliman announced plans to convert most of the then 171 remaining Noggles locations into Del Taco restaurants by the end of that summer. The conversion process dragged out across several more years before the very last Noggles finally closed its doors for good. Del Taco converted 7 of the 8 remaining Noggles locations in Nevada to the Del Taco brand in March of 1994, with company officials stating the conversions actually led to a meaningful increase in sales at those specific locations. 7 months later, in October of 1994, Del Taco finished converting all 6 remaining Noggles locations across the state of Utah. That December, the company completed converting the 4 remaining Noggles restaurants in the St. Louis metropolitan area. The very last Noggles locations anywhere in the country, all of them in Nevada, finally closed between 1994 and 1995, with the last holdout in Carson City, Nevada, eventually becoming an entirely different restaurant called China East, rather than converting to Del Taco at all. For more than a decade after that final closure, Noggles existed only as a memory, the kind of restaurant that people who grew up in Southern California in the 1970s and 1980s would bring up wistfully whenever the topic of old fast food chains came around. In August of 2006, a blogger named Christian Zebarth, who ran a site about Orange County Mexican restaurants, posted a piece about how much he missed Noggles and wished Del Taco would bring back some of its old, unique menu items. The response surprised him. Hundreds of other people left comments saying they felt exactly the same way, and the post generated enough genuine interest that a Del Taco public relations staffer eventually reached out to Zebarth directly to discuss the renewed attention. What started as nostalgic blogging eventually turned into a genuine legal fight over who actually owned the right to use the Noggles name. Zebarth spent years arguing that Del Taco had effectively abandoned the Noggles trademark, since the company hadn't meaningfully used the name in connection with any real restaurant since the chain fully disappeared back in 1995. Under American trademark law, a name that goes unused in commerce for long enough can be legally canceled for abandonment, and that exact rule became the foundation of Zebarth's case. Del Taco pushed back, pointing to things like old Noggles branded t-shirts still sold on its website and a so-called secret menu that supposedly still offered a few old Noggles items to customers who knew to ask. Del Taco's vice president of marketing even submitted printed menus and archived screenshots from the Wayback Machine as evidence that the company had kept using the Noggles name in some form over the years. None of that evidence ultimately persuaded the judges. On March 31, 2015, the Trademark Trial and Appeal Board ruled in Zebarth's favor, finding that he had shown genuine intent to revive the brand, while Del Taco hadn't demonstrated the same level of real interest until Zebarth's campaign forced the issue. The revived Noggles opened its first regularly operating restaurant on the Pacific Coast Highway in Huntington Beach on May 28, 2016, taking over a building that had previously housed a Wahoo's Fish Taco location directly across from the waterfront Hilton. Crowds at the early revival events were large and enthusiastic enough that the team had to briefly pause operations at points just to sort out supply and staffing issues, a clear sign of just how much pent-up nostalgia had been building since 1995. Over the years that followed, the revived brand opened and then closed a handful of additional locations across Southern California, including spots in Stanton, Artesia, and a seasonal beachfront pop-up at Bolsa Chica State Beach, each one drawing eager crowds initially, before ultimately proving difficult to sustain as a permanent, full-scale business, the way the original chain once had been. The legal victory over Del Taco and the genuine cultural excitement around the comeback were both completely real. Turning that excitement into a lasting, profitable restaurant chain, the way Dick Noggles' original drive-thru once managed to do, has turned out to be a much harder thing to recapture. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There's another one coming up next that didn't build its restaurants to look anything like a typical fast food drive-in at all. It built every single location to look like an actual railroad dining car, complete with a real caboose parked out front. 19. Victoria Station. You ate your dinner inside an actual railroad car, and the restaurant didn't just look like a train. It was built using real, retired pieces of one. Victoria Station began as a graduate school project at Cornell University's School of Hotel Administration, dreamed up by 3 friends who met there. Bob Freeman, Peter Lee, and Dick Bradley. They turned that school project into a real restaurant years later, opening the first Victoria Station in San Francisco in December of 1969, on the Embarcadero at Broadway. The building itself was assembled from 5 old boxcars and 2 cabooses, arranged around a central lobby, creating a 158-seat restaurant, unlike anything most diners had walked into before. Freeman later described buying British Railroad lamps directly from contacts at British Rail and flying them home using his employee discount from Pan Am, simply to furnish the inside of the restaurant properly. That first location made roughly $90,000 a month during its very first year, a strong enough start that the idea clearly had real staying power beyond the classroom. Walking up to the door, you passed through a London-style phone booth before you even reached your table. The theme of every Victoria Station loosely borrowed from London's actual Victoria Station, filled with antique English railway artifacts inside, while the buildings themselves were built from genuine American railway cars, mostly boxcars, with a signature caboose set out front of nearly every location. The menu kept things focused on a small but reliable lineup, prime rib as the clear specialty, alongside steaks, barbecued beef ribs, roast chicken, and a shrimp dish called Shrimp Victoria, made in a style similar to scampi. Salads sometimes arrived pushed table to table on old baggage carts, keeping the railroad theme running through even the smallest details of the meal itself. Country singer Johnny Cash recorded an entire promotional album of train songs for the chain in 1975, titled Destination Victoria Station, a level of theming that few restaurant chains before or since have ever matched. The chain grew fast enough that by the end of 1978, Victoria Station operated 97 restaurants, every single one of them company-owned rather than franchised out. At its peak in the 1970s, the chain reached roughly 100 locations, spread across the United States and Canada, including one massive location built directly at Universal Studios in Hollywood, which film director Alfred Hitchcock himself officially opened on May 2, 1977, by flipping a railroad switch, complete with a funicular that carried guests 600 feet up from the lower parking lot. The same decade that built the chain up eventually started taking it apart. Through the 1980s, Victoria Station began closing locations as financial pressure mounted, and the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1986. A reorganization agreement reached in early January of 1987 issued secured notes and closed additional locations to repay the company's creditors. Later that year, a new entity called Victoria Station Acquisition Corporation, formed by Lowell Farkas, purchased the trademark along with 11 of the remaining restaurants, but that smaller operation never recovered the scale of the original chain. By 1992, Victoria Station had effectively disappeared from the American restaurant landscape entirely. The giant Universal Studios location managed to hang on the longest of the major restaurants, finally closing in 1997. One single Victoria Station, in Salem, Massachusetts, kept the name alive far longer than anywhere else, operating under private ownership decades after the original company had collapsed. That last location finally closed in December of 2017, more than 48 years after Freeman, Lee, and Bradley first turned their Cornell class project into a working restaurant made out of real boxcars on the San Francisco waterfront. A separate, unrelated chain using the same Victoria Station name still operates in Malaysia today, though it claims its own independent history entirely, with no actual connection to the American company those 3 Cornell graduates once built. There's another one coming up that didn't sell steak or prime rib at all. It sold pies, and it carried the name of a fictional pie-baking mascot straight through 3 completely different corporate owners before most people ever noticed the restaurant itself had quietly changed shape underneath them. 20. Baker's Square, Poppin' Fresh Pies. You ordered a slice of pie from a restaurant that started out under a name almost nobody outside Iowa would recognize today. The story starts in December of 1969, when a restaurant called Mrs. C's opened in Des Moines, Iowa. The menu was simple: sandwiches and soup, the kind of food you'd expect from any small local diner at the time. What made Mrs. C's stand out had nothing to do with the sandwiches. It was the pies, cream pies, and double-crusted fruit pies that built a reputation strong enough to reach beyond Iowa entirely. The Pillsbury Company noticed and bought the restaurant, renaming it Poppin' Fresh Pies, a name that borrowed directly from Pillsbury's own famous doughboy mascot. Under Pillsbury's ownership, the chain expanded across the Midwest and beyond through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, growing into a real restaurant chain built almost entirely around the reputation of those original pies from a small Iowa diner. The name on the sign changed again in 1983, and this time it came with a much bigger company attached. Vicorp Restaurants, the company that already owned the Village Inn pancake house chain, purchased Poppin' Fresh Pies from Pillsbury in May of 1983, acquiring 59 restaurant locations along with a baking facility near Chicago. Vicorp renamed the chain Baker's Square, a name meant to put the focus squarely on baking itself. Under Vicorp's ownership, Baker's Square kept the pies front and center while building out full breakfast, lunch, and dinner menus around them. Over the years, the chain's pies won more than 300 awards from the American Pie Council National Pie Championships, with the chain's French silk pie becoming one of its most recognizable signature items. 1 year after the rename, Baker's Square grew through a connection to a chain that's already appeared earlier in this very list. In 1984, Vicorp acquired 175 former Sambo's restaurants across California, Florida, and Arizona, restaurants left behind after Sambo's collapsed into bankruptcy that same year. Vicorp converted the California locations specifically into Baker's Square restaurants, while the Florida and Arizona locations became Village Inns instead. That single acquisition helped push Baker's Square deep into California, a state where the chain would go on to operate for decades, built in part on buildings that had once served pancakes under the murals, and the name that Sambo's had finally been forced to give up. Baker's Square kept growing through the rest of the 1980s and into the 1990s, eventually peaking at 148 locations by 2001, spread heavily across the upper Midwest and California alike. The chain's California presence in particular flourished well into the early 2000s, a real success story for a restaurant that had started out as a single pie-focused diner in Iowa more than 3 decades earlier. The same economic forces that had worn down so many other chains on this list eventually caught up with Baker's Square too. By 2005, profit margins across the chain had started declining noticeably as the broader economy and the restaurant industry as a whole began struggling. Baker's Square responded by closing rural and suburban California locations as their leases expired, while remaining locations went without the kind of remodeling other casual dining chains were investing in during that same period. By February of 2009, more than 80 California locations had closed entirely. On April 3, 2008, Vicorp filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, closing 56 company-owned restaurants across both the Baker's Square and Village Inn brands in the process, leaving a combined total of 343 locations standing between the two chains. The very first Baker's Square, the original Mrs. C's building on Merle Hay Road in Des Moines that had started this whole story back in 1969, closed permanently on April 2, 2008, just 1 day before the bankruptcy filing itself. In 2009, a company called American Blue Ribbon Holdings, owned by Fidelity National Financial and Newport Global Advisors, acquired Vicorp's remaining assets, including both Village Inn and Baker's Square. Closures continued under the new ownership. Vicorp shut down its Los Angeles County pie production facility entirely, leaving 2 remaining bakeries in Oak Forest, Illinois, and Chaska, Minnesota, to keep producing pies for the surviving locations, eventually turning out roughly 18 to 25 million pies a year between them, under a production arm later renamed Legendary Baking. In March of 2009, 4 Baker's Square locations in the San Francisco Bay Area were sold off to Shari's Restaurants, which kept the Baker's Square name on those buildings for only about 8 more months before changing them over entirely. The company filed for bankruptcy again in January of 2020, closing 33 more locations across both Village Inn and Baker's Square, leaving just 14 Baker's Square restaurants standing under a restructured company called Vibsk Holdings. On January 24, 2020, 9 more Baker's Square locations closed permanently, in towns spread across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Minnesota. In 2021, ownership changed hands one final time when Barbecue Holdings, the company behind Famous Dave's and Tahoe Joe's, acquired Baker's Square along with Village Inn. Today, only a small handful of standalone Baker's Square restaurants remain, scattered across Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, and Ohio, a tiny fraction of the 148 locations the chain once operated at its peak. The pies themselves never disappeared entirely. They're still sold today on dessert menus at Famous Dave's and other Barbecue Holdings restaurants, carrying the Baker's Square name forward, even in buildings that have nothing else to do with the chain that built that reputation. What began as a single diner in Des Moines known simply for good pie passed through the hands of one of the largest food companies in America, absorbed the wreckage of a restaurant chain that collapsed under the weight of its own name, survived 2 separate corporate bankruptcies, and still managed to keep its pies on dessert menus somewhere in the country more than 50 years after Mrs. C's first opened its doors. 20 restaurants, 20 different reasons for disappearing, and in nearly every single case, the same quiet ending. A building that's still standing somewhere, doing something else entirely now, with most of the people driving past it having no idea what it used to be. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.